Hello， 大家好，欢迎关注华尔街电视频道。这一期的华尔街突发，关注一则刚刚发生的消息：俄罗斯瓦格纳集团的首领普里戈津，他的一架公务机在俄罗斯的特维尔地区坠毁。这是一架巴西航空工业的莱格赛600型号飞机。那在美东时间的2023年8月23日下午BBC 报道称，普里戈津也在这架坠毁的飞机上。此外，有消息显示，普里戈津在瓦格纳集团的合伙人德米特里·乌特金也在这架飞机上。这架飞机截止到美东时间的这个8月23日的下午有信息显示，飞机上至少已经出现了10名遇难者。这架飞机此前是在媒体上频繁出镜。在2023年的6月底俄罗斯雇佣兵瓦格纳集团就经历了短暂的兵变行动，事件得以平息。当时外界是关注集团首脑普里戈津和集团的去向，而普里戈津在当时就是坐着这架飞机去了白俄罗斯，这是一种说法。当时的美国的媒体 Politico 新闻网指出，俄罗斯雇佣兵瓦格纳集团的首领普里戈津的这架私人飞机注册号为 2A02795， 在当时6月27日上午降落在了距白俄罗斯首都明斯克约20公里的一个军用机场。而稍早呢，8月21日，俄罗斯瓦格纳集团的首领普里戈津在附属瓦格纳集团的一个电报频道上是张贴了他自6月底领导短暂兵变以来的首个视频讲话。在普里戈津的这个视频讲话中，他身穿迷彩服，手持一支步枪，站在一个看似是沙漠的地带，远处有更多的武装人员和一辆皮卡。那么报道的路透社是无法地理定位或核实这个视频的日期。但普里戈津的讲话和亲瓦格纳集团频道的一些贴文显示普里戈津这是在非洲拍摄的。普里戈津在视频里说气温50多度都是我们喜欢的。瓦格纳集团让俄罗斯在所有大陆更加伟大，让非洲更加自由，让非洲人民获得正义和幸福。我们正把伊斯兰国、基地组织和其他土匪们的生活变成噩梦。他随后说，瓦格纳集团正在招人，将履行确定的任务。视频还提供了一个电话号码，供那些希望加入的人使用。普里戈津6月底领导反对俄罗斯国防建制的短命兵变之后，他和瓦格纳集团的未来就一直不明确。克里姆林宫就说，普里戈津和一些参加了乌克兰战争部分最激烈战斗的人员将前往白俄罗斯。一些瓦格纳集团战斗人员在兵变后前往了白俄罗斯，开始训练那里的军队。普里戈津在7月底公布的讲话中还说瓦格纳集团准备进一步增加在非洲的存在。而在另外一边，世界末日将军有着这个称号的苏罗维金上将被解职。瓦格纳兵变失败2个月后，与瓦格纳老板普里戈津关系密切的苏罗维金上将据报是被免职了。但是你现在看到的这个屏幕上的是这个瓦格纳集团的另外一个创始人之一普里戈津本人我们之前也提到了，他是在非洲现身。法新社在8月23日周三引述了多家媒体报道，曾负责进攻乌克兰的俄罗斯将军谢尔盖·苏罗维金在瓦格纳叛乱2个月后被解除了航空航天部队司令的职务，他被认为是与瓦格纳关系密切。据俄罗斯国家通讯社在8月23日援引熟悉军队内情的消息来源说陆军上将谢尔盖·苏罗维金已被解职。那据俄罗斯卫星通讯社报道，现年56岁的苏罗维金的职务已被维克托·阿夫扎罗夫将军接替。克里姆林宫和俄罗斯国防部都没有立即发布任何公告，而军队内部的变动往往是在暗中进行。那突然几乎是同一天这个一架普里戈津注册下的飞机坠毁据报普里戈津也在飞机上。另外一边，这个普里戈津的合伙人他的这个末日上将也被解除了职务让人猜测这个俄罗斯军中是不是有大事正在发生。然而，俄罗斯日报和莫斯科回声电台的前主编维内迪克托夫宣布，苏罗维金上将被解职的消息。另外，报道乌克兰战事有影响力的军事博主瑞巴尔也宣布了这个苏罗维金上将被解职的消息。苏罗维金因手段残忍而被称为世界末日将军，是俄罗斯军事干预乌克兰的主要指挥官之一。此前，他曾得到瓦格纳这个首领普里戈津和车臣领导人卡德罗夫的公开支持和赞扬。 自瓦格纳的叛乱于6月底结束以来，一直有俄罗斯军事指挥部改组的传闻，特别是关于谢尔盖·苏罗维金的传闻。瓦格纳雇佣军集团在24小时内的叛动是震动了当时俄国的当局。在此期间，苏罗维金是呼吁兵变者停止，尽快返回军营。但这位将军被认为是与瓦格纳及其领导人普里戈津关系密切。在2022年的10月，苏罗维金被任命为俄军驻乌克兰总部队的指挥官。在次年的11月他不得不下令撤出赫尔松镇和第聂波河的右岸。那么这对莫斯科来说是一次耻辱性的失败。他在上任仅3个月后就被俄罗斯参谋长格拉西莫夫取代。那谢尔盖·苏罗维金作为苏联阿富汗战争和2000年代第2次车臣战争的老兵，还参加了2015年俄罗斯在叙利亚的残酷战役。他也获得了一个叫做叙利亚屠夫的绰号。那普里戈津呢？这个人是生于1961年，在当时的这个列宁格勒出生，即现在的圣彼得堡。根据报道普里戈津在20多岁的时候，因抢劫罪和欺诈罪在苏联监狱服刑了9年。出狱的时候，苏联解体，普里戈津走上创业道路。他在家乡做起了热狗食品车的生意。后来他转向更大项目，例如圣彼得堡开了一家豪华餐厅，该餐厅成为了俄罗斯精英的聚集中心，其中就包括当时的圣彼得堡副市长普京。而得益于与政治精英的密切联系，普里戈津的业务在普京就任总统后进一步扩张。他的餐饮公司康科德成立于20世纪的90年代，获得了独家且利润丰厚的国宴合同，其中包括普京的就职典礼餐饮和美国总统布什访问圣彼得堡的宴席。这些合同呢，为普里戈津赢得了普京厨师的称号。在一些华文的语境中普里戈津也被称为普厨子。不过普里戈津的野心并没有局限于餐饮业。瓦格纳雇佣兵在2014年首次介入乌克兰战事，当时他们帮助俄罗斯支持的分裂分子非法吞并了克里米亚半岛。在2022年的2月，俄罗斯全面入侵乌克兰后瓦格纳军团在乌克兰东部激战中的战斗力成为了克林姆林宫的重要军事资产。在2023年的1月，瓦格纳军团声称已控制了乌克兰城市索莱达尔，这被称为是莫斯科开战之后罕见的胜利之一。瓦格纳集团的效率及其在战场上日益重要的地位，让普里戈津获得资格对俄罗斯高级军官发动一场攻势。而普里戈津现在日益高涨的名声，也是引发了人们对普里戈津的政治野心的猜测。俄罗斯独立网络媒体叫做梅杜萨就曾经报道，普里戈津计划发起一场爱国保守运动，最终将演变成一个政党。但普里戈津曾公开否认这个看法。此外，这个斯塔诺瓦亚在卡内基国际和平基金会的文章中曾经预言，普里戈津在政治舞台上的野心可能会损害他与克林姆林宫的关系，说国内政策监管者不喜欢普里戈津的政治煽动，普里戈津对官方机构的攻击，以及他试图通过威胁组建政党来控制普京的幕僚，这些都会让克林姆林宫的每个人感到头疼。我们也会继续关注这一架飞机失事之后更多的新的消息，请锁定华尔街电视频道以及今日华尔街频道。好了，以上就是今天华尔街突发的所有内容。更多资讯可以关注6度简报网，网址是6度brief.com， 在上面各位可以订阅各类符合您喜好的简报新闻，有免费套餐，也有更加专业的付费套餐供大家选择。今天的视频就到这里，我们下个节目再见。俄罗斯瓦格纳集团的首领普里戈津，他的一架公务机在俄罗斯的特维尔地区坠毁，这是一架巴西航空工业的莱格赛600型号飞机。那在美东时间的2023年8月23日下午BBC 报道称，普里戈津也在这架坠毁的飞机上。此外，有消息显示，普里戈津在瓦格纳集团的合伙人德米特里乌特金也在这架飞机上。这架飞机截止到美东时间的这个8月23日的下午有信息显示，飞机上至少已经出现了10名这个遇难者。这架飞机此前是在媒体上频繁出镜。在2023年的6月底俄罗斯雇佣兵瓦格纳集团就经历了短暂的兵变行动，事件得以平息。当时外界是关注集团首脑普里戈津和集团的去向，而普里戈津在当时就是坐着这架飞机去了白俄罗斯，这是一种说法。当时的美国的媒体 Politico 新闻网指出，俄罗斯雇佣兵瓦格纳集团的首领普里戈津的这架私人飞机注册号为 RA02795，在当时6月27日上午降落在了距白俄罗斯首都明斯克约20公里的一个军用机场。而稍早呢，8月21日， 俄罗斯瓦格纳集团的首领普里戈津在附属瓦格纳集团的一个电报频道上是张贴了他自6月底领导短暂兵变以来的首个视频讲话。在普里戈津的这个视频讲话中，他身穿迷彩服，手持一支步枪，站在一个看似是沙漠的地带，远处有更多的武装人员和一辆皮卡。那么报道的路透社是无法地理定位或核实这个视频的日期，但普里戈津的讲话和亲瓦格纳集团频道的一些贴文显示普里戈津这是在非洲拍摄的。普里戈津在视频里说气温50多度都是我们喜欢的。瓦格纳集团让俄罗斯在所有大陆更加伟大，让非洲更加自由，让非洲人民获得正义和幸福。我们正把伊斯兰国、基地组织和其他土匪们的生活变成噩梦。他随后说，瓦格纳集团正在招人，将履行确定的任务。视频还提供了一个电话号码，供那些希望加入的人使用。普里戈津6月底领导反对俄罗斯国防建制的短命兵变之后，他和瓦格纳集团的未来就一直不明确。克里姆林宫就说，普里戈津和一些参加了乌克兰战争部分最激烈战斗的人员将前往白俄罗斯。一些瓦格纳集团战斗人员在兵变后前往了白俄罗斯，开始训练那里的军队。普里戈津在7月底公布的讲话中还说，瓦格纳集团准备进一步增加在非洲的存在。而在另外一边，世界末日将军有着这个称号的苏罗维金上将被解职。瓦格纳兵变失败2个月后，与瓦格纳老板普里戈津关系密切的苏罗维金上将据报是被免职了。但是你现在看到的这个屏幕上的是这个瓦格纳集团的另外一个创始人之一普里戈津本人我们之前也提到了，他是在非洲现身。法新社在8月23日周三引述了多家媒体报道，曾负责进攻乌克兰的俄罗斯将军谢尔盖·苏罗维金在瓦格纳叛乱2个月后被解除了航空航天部队司令的职务，他被认为是与瓦格纳关系密切。据俄罗斯国家通讯社在8月23日援引熟悉军内内情的消息来源说陆军上将谢尔盖·苏罗维金已被解职。那据俄罗斯卫星通讯社报道，现年56岁的苏罗维金的职务已被维科托·阿夫扎罗夫将军接替。克里姆林宫和俄罗斯国防部都没有立即发布任何公告，而军队内部的变动往往是在暗中进行。那突然几乎是同一天这个一架普里戈津注册下的飞机坠毁据报普里戈津也在飞机上。另外一边，这个普里戈津的合伙人，他的这个末日上将也被解除了职务让人猜测这个俄罗斯军中是不是有大事正在发生。然而，俄罗斯日报和莫斯科回声电台的前主编维内迪克托夫宣布，苏罗维金上将被解职的消息。另外，报道乌克兰战事有影响力的军事博主瑞巴尔也宣布了这个苏罗维金上将被解职的消息。苏罗维金因手段残忍而被称为世界末日将军，是俄罗斯军事干预乌克兰的主要指挥官之一。此前，他曾得到瓦格纳这个首领普里戈津和车臣领导人卡德罗夫的公开支持和赞扬。自瓦格纳的叛乱于6月底结束以来，一直有俄罗斯军事指挥部改组的传闻，特别是关于谢尔盖·苏罗维金的传闻。瓦格纳雇佣军集团在24小时内的叛动是震动了当时俄国的当局。在此期间，苏罗维金是呼吁兵变者停止，尽快返回军营。但这位将军被认为是与瓦格纳及其领导人普里戈津关系密切。在2022年的10月，苏罗维金被任命为俄军驻乌克兰总部队的指挥官。在次年的11月他不得不下令撤出赫尔松镇和第聂波河的右岸。那么这对莫斯科来说是一次耻辱性的失败。他在上任仅3个月后就被俄罗斯参谋长格拉西莫夫取代。那谢尔盖·苏罗维金作为苏联阿富汗战争和2000年代第2次车臣战争的老兵，还参加了2015年俄罗斯在叙利亚的残酷战役。他也获得了一个叫做叙利亚屠夫的绰号。那普里戈津呢？这个人是生于1961年，在当时的这个列宁格勒出生，即现在的圣彼得堡。根据报道普里戈津在20多岁的时候因抢劫罪和欺诈罪在苏联监狱服刑了9年。出狱的时候，苏联解体，普里戈津走上创业道路。他在家乡做起了热狗食品车的生意。后来他转向更大项目，例如圣彼得堡开了一家豪华餐厅，该餐厅成为了俄罗斯精英的聚集中心，其中就包括当时的圣彼得堡副市长普京。 而得益于与政治精英的密切联系，普里戈津的业务在普京就任总统后进一步扩张。他的餐饮公司康科德成立于20世纪的90年代，获得了独家且利润丰厚的国宴合同，其中包括普京的就职典礼餐饮和美国总统布什访问圣彼得堡的宴席。这些合同呢，为普里戈津赢得了普京厨师的称号。而在一些华文的语境中普里戈津也被称为普厨子。不过普里戈津的野心并没有局限于餐饮业。瓦格纳雇佣兵在2014年首次介入乌克兰战事，当时他们帮助俄罗斯支持的分裂分子非法吞并了克里米亚半岛。在2022年的2月，俄罗斯全面入侵乌克兰后瓦格纳军团在乌克兰东部激战中的战斗力成为了克林姆林宫的重要军事资产。在2023年的1月，瓦格纳军团声称已控制了乌克兰城市索莱达尔，这被称为是莫斯科开战之后罕见的胜利之一。瓦格纳集团的效率及其在战场上日益重要的地位，让普里戈津获得资格对俄罗斯高级军官发动一场攻势。而普里戈津现在日益高涨的名声，也是引发了人们对普里戈津的政治野心的猜测。俄罗斯独立网络媒体叫做梅杜萨就曾经报道，普里戈津计划发起一场爱国保守运动，最终将演变成一个政党，但普里戈津曾公开否认这个看法。此外，这个斯塔诺瓦亚在卡内基国际和平基金会的文章中曾经预言，普里戈津在政治舞台上的野心可能会损害他与克林姆林宫的关系，说国内政策监管者不喜欢普里戈津的政治煽动，普里戈津对官方机构的攻击，以及他试图通过威胁组建政党来控制普京的幕僚，这些都会让克林姆林宫的每个人感到头疼。我们也会继续关注这一架飞机失事之后更多的新的消息，请锁定华尔街电视频道以及今日华尔街频道。
We are holding this as Ukraine's long-anticipated counteroffensive starts to unfold. We're a few weeks in. It comes in the wake of last week's NATO summit in Vilnius, which on the one hand left Ukrainian officials frustrated with a lack of any clarity on membership, but did, I think, reinforce the NATO commitment to Ukraine over the long haul. And then also a few weeks away from the strange rebellion of Prigozhin in Russia, and I think our attempts to make sense of where that leaves Putin and what decision-making might look like from the Kremlin's perspective. And also, of course, to mark the release of the new issue of Foreign Affairs, the July-August issue. The cover of that issue asks, "Tell me how this ends. Is there a path to victory in Ukraine?" And that is the big question we will try to get at in our conversation today. We are lucky to have a fantastic slate of guests. Each of them has contributed really a slew of important pieces to the magazine over the last couple of years. I will quickly introduce them, and then we will jump into conversation among the four of us before going to questions from all of you a little bit about halfway through the conversation. First, we have Sam Cherop, who is the author of a trenchant essay in the new issue, which is called An Unwinnable War: Washington Needs an Endgame in Ukraine. Sam is a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation and previously served on the State Department policy planning staff during the Obama administration. Next, we have Fiona Hill. Fiona served as senior director for Russia and Europe on the National Security Council from 2017 to 2019. She's now a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, has written 3 or 4 really powerful essays on Putin and Russia for Foreign Affairs over the last couple of years. The most recent of those from a few months ago, it's called The Kremlin's Grand Illusions, but it's also well worth revisiting the piece she did before the war called The Kremlin's Strange Victory, which is especially resonant at a moment when U.S. policy toward Ukraine and toward Russia is once again intersecting with a presidential election in which Donald Trump features quite prominently. And last but not least, we have Andrei Zagorodniak, who served as Ukraine's Minister of Defense under President Zelensky in 2019 and 2020. He is now the chair of the Center for Defense Strategies. He's done a few really notable pieces for FA over the last year. The most recent one made the case for Ukraine's NATO membership, but would also point you in the context of this conversation to a piece he did last year on Ukraine's path to victory, kind of laying out an expansive definition of victory as seen from Kyiv. And Andrei is joining us from his car, as you can see, somewhere in central Ukraine. He has been traveling around, seeing various parts of the battlefield, parts of the front. So he is especially well positioned to bring us some of the ground truth as we try to make sense of where things are. So Andrei, let me start with you. there's been so much argument over strategy in the last 6 months that has centered on the prospects of Ukraine's counteroffensive, which is now unfolding. I think a lot of the kind of early analyses of the counteroffensive are fundamentally motivated by different senses of where the war might end. You've seen this on the ground more directly than certainly anyone in this conversation. What should we make of the counteroffensive so far? How's it going, and what are the prospects as you look ahead?
Thank you, and hello everyone, and thank you for inviting here. First of all, I have to say that speaking to people who participate in that, and then creating this understanding where things are, and then obviously looking at the whole information space and around the world, it creates an opinion that we're also almost talking about two different realities and two different events. Because indeed, there's been a very hard work, extremely tough, extremely dangerous, we have lots of losses. We have lots of losses in equipment, lots of losses in among people, but there is absolute determination that to make this as a success. And then the main objective right now, the main sort of focus is on ability of Russians to defend their positions. So, which means that there's a substantial focus on destroying the logistical facilities, warehouses, particularly the ammunition depots, command posts, and just to make sure that whoever is left with of the people is basically they're deprived from basic command and control structure, logistical support, and so on and so on. That is number one priority, comparing to just a sort of percentage of territory gained, and this is important to distinguish, because sometimes I talk to journalists when I go back to Kiev, and the whole question which they ask is like, okay, how many villages are retaken? How many square kilometers of land is retaken? That's not the performance indicator which people are looking at least at this point of time. So then the next point is that, of course, attacking Russian positions with the which are quite heavily fortified, particularly in some areas, and the quantity of landmines is just staggering. We have sometimes landmines in a distance of like half meter for each for one from another. It's very difficult sometimes to locate them, and it's tough to plan any operations, understanding that they're pretty much everywhere in some of the areas. Plus, generally, the several levels of the fortification lines. The question is not like whether it's possible or not. The question is like we just need to make sure that it's done in a very proper way, in a very careful way. And the last thing we need to do is to rush. Of course, as soon as basically, it's tough to me to say, because I'm obviously understanding this from the discussion of the operational experts which are on the ground. But basically, the idea is that they're looking for windows of opportunity, and they're looking for some specific areas. They're working on these areas. It's not happening so fast, but they're absolutely confident that there will be another phase, another stage where they already passed through some defense lines, and then obviously the situation will be completely different. What the people who I'm in touch with, they see as a success factor is more the as I said from the beginning, is a destruction of the capabilities in the near area. So basically operational depths of I don't know, 20, 30, 50, sometimes 100 kilometers. So as much as they're weakened from that side, I mean, deprives them of ability to keep defending later, and that's basically what is the main focus and the main priorities. And then of course there's the whole like a massive wave of information attention to this, and sometimes it's perceived in a quite different way, and it's tough to say what the one should do about that, except that all I can say at this stage is that I'm quite, let's put it this way, I'm absolutely certain that the commanders which are currently on the ground, they know what to do. Of course, the different brigades have different experience, different battalions have different training, and so indeed sometimes the performance very much different between the well-trained and experienced and not trained and less experienced. But I'm positive that we will see the development further, and it's going to be a success.
Let me turn to you to do what you can to make sense of how things look from Moscow. We all watched the Prigozhin affair a few weeks ago with, I think, fascination. That led to some analysis that Putin was much weaker than we thought. As we've watched things unfold in the last few weeks, it's a little bit hard to say whether that's true or not. What do you make of the state of Putin's power, whether there are real threats to his grip, whether that does indicate anything about the state of his regime? And then second, how do you think he sees the path forward in the war? What is his theory of what he's trying to do in the months ahead?
Thanks very much, Daniel. It's really great to be with everyone. And obviously, I hope people have been paying, very close attention to what Andrei has been saying here, because there's a couple of points that relate to what you've just asked me to focus on, Daniel, as well, because I'm actually sitting in Berlin at the moment. I've been here for 5 months. And actually, it feels like I'm in Moscow a lot of the time because there are so many Russians here, many who people on this call know. So many people have transplanted here. Obviously, they're debating all the time all of these same questions. There are also, of course, an enormous number of refugees from Ukraine and also from Belarus. So, I mean, this is, kind of a bit in a way, a transplanting of a lot of the areas of discussion and another reality here, on top of the German and European and other perspectives. So you get to pick up on quite a lot of information from the Berlin vantage point. And one thing, first of all, to pivot from in terms of talking about Putin's own grip on the regime and then where he thinks things play from here, is this point that Andrei has mentioned about how we tend to fixate on percentages of territory, and that's really the wrong way to look at things. And the very fact that Andrei and all of his colleagues are finding that the defensive lines in Russia are so heavily mined really underscores the situation here. Russia does not really control, in kind of those physical military terms, all of the portions of Ukrainian territory that we always have, highlighted in the media as being under Russian occupation. There's just simply not enough people for that, which is hence why they are overcompensating with the amount of landmines to try to keep Ukraine at bay. There's also the question of the populations there. I mean, we've seen, so much of this dislocation. We have to remember it's not about percentages of territory and villages. It's about people who are under occupation and are being, tortured and, all the kinds of attacks on ordinary Ukrainians, because really, the Russians and Putin are very worried about their grip on the territory that they've taken. It's not just a question of Crimea. We're, of course, talking today against the backdrop of yet an incident on the Kerch Strait Bridge. But it's also kind of a question of how much does Russia really have a grip on Kherson, Zaporizhia, the Donbass region, despite having declared that Russia is here to stay, and these are now parts of Russian territory. And all these things are tied together. Because if Putin can't show that he is in control, that really does undermine his position at home. And what the Wagner incident shows us here is that now the war in Ukraine, Putin's war in Ukraine, that is, it's not something that Ukrainians have started off themselves, and how things are progressing there is very much tied together to the perception of the grip of the regime. Now, it's very interesting, stepping back a little bit and looking at polling and talking to various people here in Berlin from Russia, that although everybody is saying this was a terrible mistake, there is a kind of a feeling of great angst and concern about Russia losing. And actually, if you kind of pick beyond some of the most obvious dissidents and people who are in opposition here, a lot of Russian diaspora people here in Berlin and elsewhere don't want Russia to lose. And this was reflected in the whole Wagner episode. So, what we've got from Prigozhin, in addition to the spectacle of, a rogue general or rogue mercenary heading towards Moscow, which looks like it's ripped out of the pages of history. Think about how many times this happened in ancient Rome or in any other, kind of authoritarian or historical setting. We've seen this so many times before, putschs, rogue generals and colonels being angry about the course of war. Putin himself referred to 1917, but lots of people have talked about other episodes in Russian history. But what we also had was an unveiling of the truth of this whole exercise. Basically, Prigozhin says there was no threat from Ukraine, there was no threat from NATO. This war was a mistake from the beginning, but now we have to win it in some fashion. And our generals don't know how to do it. Only the Wagner group knows how to do this. Obviously, there's business interests involved here. We're now hearing even more about the fact that the Wagner group is actually fully funded by the Kremlin. all the veil is off now about the pretense of what this was about. But it's an admission that the Russian military itself is not up to the task, beyond all of the heavy mining and the destruction of civilian settlements and the shelling and the bombing that we're seeing, that the military cannot prevail on the ground in the way that obviously they intended to. And the Wagner Group has been filling in and out. So we're seeing behind the scenes here a real kind of battle for the future of this war against the face of the counteroffensive. We've also seen all of the chinks as a result of that in Putin's grip on the security forces around him. This was a whole battle among his security forces. But the other thing that we're also seeing is that there is no sign of any evident successor to Putin. We've all been speculating about this, but I would just say that we have to be very hesitant about getting into the whole action that Putin's grip is so weakened that he could go. I see no evidence of that at this point, which doesn't to say that something couldn't happen, because we see that the situation is quite precarious. Now, just so we can move over to Sam and his commentary here. I think what the Wagner episode shows us that, as usual, all authoritarian systems are brittle and fragile. That there's a lot of fighting behind the scenes. That war always intensifies those stresses. That something could happen at any point, and that the authoritarian leader himself is the wild card in the system. He is both responsible for its failures and its successes. So everyone now is watching Putin in a way that they were not before. And of course, there's a lot, I think, of this episode to play out, because we don't know what the heck's going on with Prigozhin. We have all kinds of generals missing in action, lots of speculation about them. So this is playing out, but we now know very clearly that the whole Russian war effort was based on shifting sands, and that it's now put it under a great deal of pressure.
Sam, let me go to you on 2 points. First, let's talk a bit about the recommendations you laid out in your piece. This was a fairly clear blueprint for moving toward or laying the groundwork for negotiations now and looking ahead to negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, the United States, and other actors in the months ahead. Explain what you would like to see in the coming months, and then tell us how far that is from existing U.S. policy. What elements do you think Washington has embraced of the kind of blueprint you lay out, and where would you like to see policy change?
Great. Well, thanks, Dan. Thanks for the invitation. So, the argument I made in the piece starts out with an analysis of the trajectory of the conflict. And basically, I think we have 15 months or more now of evidence to use to draw some, at least preliminary conclusions, if not conclusions, then analytical judgments about where things are heading. And I think that evidence suggests that really neither side is in a position to deliver a decisive military victory, defined particularly as the destruction of the other side's capacity to pose a threat to it going forward. And so equally, that the political differences are now so irreconcilable between Russia and Ukraine that the idea of some sort of peace treaty or political settlement is also off the table. So we're likely to have a trajectory defined by those two dynamics, whereby both sides, neither side is capable of essentially delivering a decisive military victory. Both sides will continue to pose a threat to each other with their military capabilities, and neither will likely achieve fully their territorial goals. So that essentially where the line is just one piece of this broader puzzle that is going to be relatively continuous over time, those fundamental drivers. And so that is sort of the ingredients for a war that could go on for a very long time. And that, I think, at this point seems to me the most likely outcome. But ultimately, it's likely to end with those fundamental factors being in place. And so the point I make in the piece is that, we can either think about achieving some sort of negotiated end in the medium term. Obviously, this is not a short-term proposition, or it could be years from now. And likely the fundamentals will be not significantly altered, but the costs will have increased dramatically in both humanitarian, economic, and otherwise. And so the most likely outcome in this context looks something like an armistice being a durable ceasefire that does not resolve the political disputes between the parties. That would not end the broader conflict, but it would end the violence if it were successful. And so in the piece, there are several proposals for particular measures that would make that armistice potentially stick, including security commitments and ceasefire support mechanisms and so on. And steps that the US could take now to enable that outcome over time. So between appointing somebody who actually has a job to deal with this kind of conflict diplomacy issue, to beginning discussions with allies and the Ukrainians about this endgame, and eventually opening up channels with the Russians to engage on this issue. And of course, it's important to emphasize that none of this need come at the expense of anything else that's going on, be it the Ukrainian counteroffensive, US support, military support for it, and so on. And so I guess where I would, where I think my proposals differ from where the US is right now is that essentially they're basically on the diplomatic side right now, there's a sense that, there's not much activity at all. And there's a sense that basically it's not unlikely to yield any results, and that the cues must come from the Ukrainians on this for any sort of change. Moreover, that leverage on the battlefield will be required to get an acceptable outcome, so that we need to see this counteroffensive out and provide the Ukrainians with a better position to engage at the end of that. And I guess where I diverge somewhat is that I don't see the diplomatic piece as contradictory to the coercive pressure piece, that these things can be complementary, in fact, and mutually reinforcing. In other words, you don't lose anything by having an active channel at the very most, and you could stand to gain something in the sense of learning at least about where the other side's position is. And so I don't expect, even if this were to be implemented tomorrow, or so channels be opened and conversations about the end game to begin, that this would produce an outcome in a week or a month. We're talking about a month-long process. And in the piece, I recall the fact that it took 2 years to negotiate the Korea armistice, and during periods when the fighting was probably the most intense, and the United States incurred 45% of the casualties total during the war. So I think that the point is that there are costs to waiting, and beginning the process soon would be, I think, beneficial to all. That's the case, at least.
Andre, let me have you react to the proposal broadly, but also to think the assumptions that Sam started with, that there's not really an alternate path. You've argued that there is a path to victory that differs from the one that the course that Sam lays out. So how do you see that proposal, and how do you see where would you see potential for an alternate path?
Okay, so first of all, before I say anything, I'd like to just to reiterate to our listeners that I'm sure the participants know about that, but just wanted to say that there's no more people in the world which wants this war to end than in Ukraine. I mean, there's absolutely no desire at all to continue it longer than absolutely necessary. And people are very exhausted. People are extremely traumatized. There's a lot of tragedies happening on every day in a regular families. As you know, the majority of the armed forces are not professional military people. They became professional military people over the last year and a half, or even less. There's of course a professional element with some history, but it's minority. So we do want peace. And the only skepticism about any proposals which involve Putin's good faith is because we have extremely bad experience of dealing with that person over like very, very long period of time. So we just have a lot of track record which works against this idea. So what I outlined in the paper back in October was that we can free Ukraine. We can push through the Russian defense lines, and we can free the territory of Ukraine. And of course, then there would be need some sort of equilibrium after that, because we do need to stabilize the situation. And the question is how we're going to stabilize the situation is of course open. And that's one of the reasons why G7 last week decided to start some discussion about that, is because we are absolutely certain that only denial of opportunity to Putin to continue is something which will actually practically stop him. So what we had and again, I'm not trying to criticize Sam's position. I personally welcome all positions, and particularly the ones which soberly understand the chances and so on. The only problem which we see is that we've been in the negotiations with Putin on the Minsk Treaty, for example. Clearly, there's been a desire from Ukraine to find it. And as a person who worked for Zelensky since the beginning of his tenure as a president, I can tell he was absolutely sincere to find a solution. He tried, and lots of people were saying, we've been in war with Putin for a long time. It's not possible. He has a very different strategic goals. But he tried to do that, and the Minsk agreement didn't work out simply because we have seen that the Russian side they had a totally different goal than the peace and stability in the region. They wanted to basically to pursue with their destructive policy, and that policy and that strategy was above everything else. So, and that's why we're quite negative about the ceasefire proposals, just simply understanding that the ceasefire will give Putin an opportunity to recover, rebuild the forces, and then start again. We understand that he can do that if he stays in power, of course. He can do it in any case. So basically, we understand that wherever we push him out, even if it's like a complete line of the border of 1991, he still can start recovering. He still can, can do all this, collection. And since we know that his percentage of the economy invested in the war right now is not like it used to be in World War II when it was like over 70%. It's much less. It's several percent of the economy is in the war. So he potentially, in the long term, he has a chance to continue. And if he's stable politically, he will try to continue. So we need to learn two things. One thing is that if he goes under in the negotiations where he walks away from his claims, for example, claim on the annexed territories, claim about Crimea, claim about Donbass, and basically recognizing the defeat, that can destroy his internal political situation. So that's why we're quite skeptical that he'll do that. And secondly, if he has a chance to continue, he will continue. So our job is to make sure that he doesn't have that chance, basically deny him an opportunity. And that's why we need to build a very strong security in the region, obviously in Ukraine, in order for any realistic calculation that basically that capability is present, like in a high readiness state, disable him from starting another season of that campaign. That's basically it.
And just to be clear, can you imagine a negotiation at some point down the road when Ukraine has made more progress on the battlefield, when he might be feeling more vulnerable? Is there any circumstance under which you can imagine a negotiation with Putin?
I certainly can imagine negotiations with Russian delegation after Putin. That's for sure, because after that they will clearly understand that they need to get out of this situation, and whoever they are, they may start to play differently. With Putin, based on our understanding of his personality, I don't think he's able to do the negotiation in good faith, and that's just based on our assessment who that person is. Also, he passed through so many lines which he cannot uncross now, including the destruction of Mariupol together with inhabitants, for example. So we certainly are going to be insisting that there is a justice in place. We're certainly going to be insisting that there is a court, international tribunal in place, and so on and so on. Question how he's going to negotiate, understanding that we're pushing through that. For example, how we're clearly not going to accept his annexation of territory, because there are our people there who never ask him to come, and they are going through immense suffering every day. And we have reports and records about that on a daily basis, and it's completely terrible what's happening there. So of course, and that's why from a negotiation theory, to imagine the zone of possible agreement, even in theoretical perspective, is extremely difficult, if possible at all. That's why we are very practical people. We just see that as a something which is extremely low probability.
Fiona, let me go to you to react to this notion of negotiations, but especially you've studied Putin longer and more deeply than almost anyone in this debate. You've spent time around him. What are the prospects that there might be a space for negotiation that would yield better results than the one Andre sees?
Well, I don't think there's actually much space for yielding better results than Andre sees, to be honest. I'll be frank about that, but which does not rule out diplomacy, to push back to what Sam has been saying. Diplomacy is different from a negotiation because you're preparing the ground to get to some different place, which has to go in parallel to what we're doing on the military front. So I think that sometimes what Sam is saying is misunderstood in that regard, because I think Sam would also recognize the difficulties of basically finding some negotiated solution that doesn't lead to any kind of loss for Ukraine, because everything involves a loss of Ukraine, because Ukraine has already, as Andrei said, lost enormous amounts of people, so many people's lives traumatized and uprooted by all of this, even at the same time that it has secured a victory by pushing back Putin's initial war aims. So we've got a very complex situation at hand here, but Andrei is absolutely right. Putin has put himself into such a corner that he can't get out of it, even if he wanted to, because he's made such expansive claims to Ukraine, not just to Crimea, but to the whole of Donbass, of Donetsk and Luhansk, and all of Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, even the territories that he does not, or the Russians do not control. And they also loosely control, as I said before, much of the territory, that we see on the maps in the newspapers as being, shaded in, with Russian occupation there. He's also, as I said earlier, in terms of the attitude of Russians, made it impossible for himself to really back away, as Andreas said as well. I mean, Prigozhin was basically saying this war was a huge mistake. I mean, he's been saying even more crude terms than this, but we're not going to lose it. And that's unfortunately where we come down in most of the Russian polling, including for people who are here in exile. Many of them are actually saying in polls, we think this was disastrous, we oppose the war, we don't want to fight the war, but we don't want to see Russia lose, we don't want to see Russia give anything up, because they're thinking in terms of these absolute victories of World War I and World War II, and following the scenarios through of what happened to Germany in both of those instances. And as Sam has said, the kind of the logic of international diplomacy and negotiation seems to, result in the loss of territory somewhere along the lines, and the Russians don't want to see themselves in that regard. So that's where things become really complicated. But I do think that there is a major diplomatic effort that we could engage in. And let me just briefly explain, because there aren't two sides to this. It's not just Russia and Ukraine. It's not just sort of Russia, Ukraine, the United States and NATO. This is a huge, enormous threat for European security and also for global security, even if it's not fully recognized. We just had today Russia tearing up the Black Sea grain deal. We could have between 10 and 20 million people worldwide dying of starvation this year because of lack of access to Ukrainian grain. Lots of those minefields are on some of the most productive Ukrainian farms. We've had the Kakhovka Dam blown up, and we've had an ecological and climate disaster on our hands. We've got the threat to the Zaporizhzhia plant, which is very deliberate on the part of Russia. We've seen Russian troops already moving through the Chernobyl exclusion zone. So we see all of these ecological, climate and threats to food security that are there. This is very deliberate for Putin. He's weaponizing food, and he knows that this will have some of an effect. But we've also got Europeans. I mean, I'm hearing it all the time now, a huge sea change, particularly at the elite level in Germany and elsewhere and in Europe. People are not going to go back at this particular point to just handing things over to Vladimir Putin, because he's trying to rewrite European history. And you have the Finns who have joined NATO because of this, the Swedes who have thrown away hundreds of years of neutrality. We know that the Poles are nervous, not just the Baltic states, for example. So Europeans are party to this, and they really do see this in a different light. So it's not just a question of, Putin trying to, negotiate with just Ukraine or negotiate with the United States. Europeans now see this as intrinsic to their security as well. And whatever we do will set a precedent. Because what Putin is basically saying is any nuclear state that goes rogue and wants to, kind of basically predate on its neighbor can do so. And we have so many territorial disputes around the world that could be affected by this as well. So I think, Sam is also making a case for a big diplomatic effort. So we see Ukrainian government, going around the world. Zelensky and Yermak and Andriy and others, have been all over the place trying to talk to counterparts. It's the G7, it's other countries as well, meetings with Brazilians, attempts to meet with South Africa, basically to make this point that what's happening in Ukraine has global implications, and we need a global effort to reframe this and to try to address it. So that's diplomacy. Now, whether we get to some, negotiation at the end of that is another matter, but we can focus, as Sam is saying, on a diplomatic effort. So I think it's just a question of how we frame it and how we think about it. But we have to do that in parallel with the military effort, because ultimately there will be some kind of diplomatic response to this, and perhaps somewhere down the line, a diplomatic solution.
Sam, there's one common element, or one particular common element that strikes me in Fiona and Andre's responses, and these have come in other responses to your proposal, which is really about the willingness of the Russian side to engage in any meaningful way, even if it's correct that some kind of armistice would be more preferable than a kind of long war that has terrible human costs for Ukrainians. Above all, there's just no sign that the Russians are there. Do you see any reason to see hope on that side? Is there some path there, or even would a major diplomatic push likely bring us to a long war that will continue indefinitely?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to note, of course, that it might fail, and it's probably likely to fail. And so I have no illusions about this being easy, or Russia being particularly under this leadership, being an easy actor to deal with in international politics. I mean, I think we're past the point where anyone can make that case. I think that there are two questions, really. And the problem is that we have only secondary information about how to answer them. The first is, like, are they willing to engage at all? And some make the case that Russia is still pursuing their original maximalist aims, and they have no interest in talking under any circumstances, particularly not now. And then the question of, like, will they operate in good faith in the context of a negotiation? And so on the first question, I think I see the case for why you could make the argument that Russia is still pursuing maximalist aims and wouldn't sit down at the table. I've seen evidence to suggest that Russia has sort of had to adjust its aims given its failures. But the only way you can really find out for sure is by trying. And otherwise, it's just sort of, educated attempts at reading Putin's mind, really. So I think we don't actually lose anything by testing the proposition that under the circumstances they might be willing to engage. And the second question is, of course, do they comply with, agree with, operate in good faith during negotiations or engagement of any sort? And of course, you have to assume bad faith given Russia's history, right? How many agreements it's broken that related to Ukraine's security, how many times it has reneged on ceasefire agreements, etc. I think the point to make here, though, is that there have been good ceasefire agreements in the past in history, and bad ones. And Andrei rightly points to the failures of the Minsk agreement to ever really produce security outcomes for Ukraine. And so the focus, I think, should be on how to make this, if there is to be one, a good one that actually holds and that denies the opportunity to transform it into an operational pause. And I think that, there are ways you can imagine doing that. Part of that, the groundwork was laid at the Vilnius summit with the beginning of the negotiation of security, long-term security commitments for Ukraine. It's going to have to be, a mixture of deterrence and sort of diplomatic mechanisms that reinforce the ceasefire. But we sort of have to assume bad faith and try nonetheless to find ways of basically boxing in the Russians so they can't, so that the cost of violating any potential agreement is higher than any gains that are perceived to accrue from it.
Great. Well, I will leave it there. And Sam, let's go to questions from those on the line. Let me remind everyone that we are on the record, and that includes those of you asking questions. Also, please keep your questions crisp and make them questions so we can get in as many as possible. Sam, let's go to the first one.
Our first question is a written submission from Allie Wine, who asks, Almost 17 months into the war, how do Ukraine, Russia, and NATO respectively conceptualize victory and defeat? And what would each of them consider to be a minimally acceptable outcome?
Thanks, Holly, for that. Why don't we go to Andre quickly, and then Fiona, and then Sam, if you want to add anything, you may.
Our understanding of the minimum outcome is that we free our territory so the people are not suffering any longer. And that also includes people who are currently kidnapped, particularly children. We have tens of thousands of children which have been illegally deported to Russia. They clearly need to come home, because the conditions in which some of them are kept is completely unacceptable. And the fact that they're not at home and then away from families is also completely unacceptable. And and apart from territories, and apart from from returning our people, is also of course the question of justice. We believe that we don't want to live in the world where people can do things like that without the convictions and without the proper legal qualification. Thank you.
Fiona, let me go to you and ask you to especially focus on the Russian definition of victory at this point.
Well, I mean, I think Andrew's, very clearly, laid out, kind of a victory path that others, would accept as well. But I mean, with Russia, at this particular point, I mean, are we talking about Putin's definition of victory, and of others as well? Because Andrei is talking about a shared sense, and I don't think there is a shared sense in Russia, and that kind of becomes part of the problem for all the issues we were talking about before. Putin has made it very clear what's his victory. Unfortunately for him, because he hasn't left a lot of wiggle room, even though Sam said obviously they've adjusted somewhat, and it's basically keeping control of the territories he declared to be now part of Russia, and that creates an enormous problem. And for other Russians in opinion polls, as we're seeing, it would be definitely the end of the war. They want the war to end, but without losing anything. And so those definitions definitely collide with what Andrei has said. And I think if we come back to other Europeans, and Sam can add to this as well. I mean, NATO and other Europeans would want to see, who are not in NATO, would want to see the return of deterrence and strategic stability to Europe, because this is a failure of European deterrence. And when you think about the Finns and the Swedes wanting to join NATO, it's because of the risk now that that they see that Russia could, invade another country as well. A risk that becomes even more heightened as a result of, what they did in Ukraine, having lied about all of the build-up to this war. So, we need to have a return to the idea that Europe is not going back to previous centuries, and that we once again restore the prohibition against war and the use of force to change borders, or to actually, change any political arrangements within Europe. So, I mean, right now, Russia is completely out of step with all of the rest of Europe, as well as of Ukraine, and how it would define, or rather how Putin and some of the others around him would define a victory.
Sam, anything you would add on the NATO definition, especially?
Well, I mean, I think on the one hand, there's an emerging narrative that Russia has already lost, and you heard President Biden essentially articulate that in Helsinki, I believe, at the tail end of his European trip. And I think that does reflect that wasn't just an off-the-cuff remark, I would say. But on the details, I think there's still the official policy of sort of essentially not getting into details about the outcome, and that might be acceptable in terms of how this ends. I would add one thing on Russian goals, though, which is that there's a striking degree of vagueness in the details about what Putin talks about when he talks about victory. Just one case in point, they've yet to officially declare where their view of the borders of these two new regions they claim to be their own, Kherson and Zaporizhia, the regions of Ukraine, whether the administrative boundaries of Ukraine are what they claim to be the new borders. There's no clarity on that at the official level, which I think does leave them some wiggle room. And I think that is actually classic Putin, where he sort of keeps his options open and doesn't actually commit himself to any particular or detailed outcome there. He has, of course, claimed them, but he hasn't said what the boundaries are. I think that's an interesting. I wouldn't read too much into that, but it does suggest that there's a little bit of he's giving himself a little bit of negotiating room.
Sam, let's go to the next question.
Our next question is from Joseph Nye.
This is a great discussion. Fiona, I want to take you back to your days as National Intelligence Officer for Russia, and imagine that you have a request from the White House for an estimate of the probabilities that Putin, having put himself into this box, will use a nuclear weapon tactically over the Black Sea or over a front unit or whatever. And what's your estimate of the probabilities, and what's your estimate of the outcome were he to do so?
Thank you, Joe. And we should add for everyone else on the line that you are a former head of the National Intelligence Council. So this is a more than just a casual question. But Fiona, I'll go to you.
And also a former dean of the Kennedy School when I used to work there. I'm sort of feeling like I'm back in class, kind of getting grilled again. You probably saw my expression going, "Oh God, the probability." Look, I mean, to be in all honesty, I want to be very careful about that, because I think that those probabilities are also very case dependent. And Andriy, and others will remember that when the Russian troops were pinned down some time ago on the other side of the Dnipro in Kherson province, that there was a lot of concern at that point, a higher probability that they might resort to a tactical nuclear weapon. And what we've been trying to do at all times is to reduce that and to make those cases all the less. I mean, the very fact that Ukraine is having such hard going, with landmines, the kind of conventional warfare, is showing that the Russians themselves are, perhaps also trying to avoid this instance, because they did get a lot of pressure put on them by China, by India, and by other countries. So, I mean, look, the probability goes up when the constraints are not there and in very specific cases. So this is not a kind of a blanket issue. I mean, right now we're also concerned not just about the tactical nuclear weapons per se, but about the manipulation of the Zaporizhzhia plant. The Zaporizhzhia plant is actually a very safe design plant, but it's not safe if it's being shelled and if it's basically been having, reduced access to cooling. And we've had to see, the plant being shut down. We've had plenty of statements being made by Rafael Grossi, for example. We should be having an international, larger scale intervention. This gets to the diplomatic effort I was talking about before. But we should be reducing whatever we see that when the probability starts to go up. And again, I don't want to play around with that, because I think, part of it is also the terror tactics that Russia is engaging in. So if I give a probability that looks higher, I'm going to scare the hell out of everyone. And I don't want to, play the part of Vladimir Putin, because that's definitely what he's trying to do. This is a psychological game here to make the links to the Euro missile crisis, the Cuban missile crisis, which he's threatened to do publicly in, many cases in the past, to basically manipulate, the populations in Ukraine and elsewhere. And people are now onto that game. But again, the probability goes up in certain circumstances if they feel that the defences are being overrun, and also if they feel that there will be a chance to actually have an effect of that, so more likely to have a negotiation on Putin's terms. So we have to keep up the pressure. Basically, the United Nations supporting Rafael Grossi, but also keeping China, India, and other nuclear players in on the game to reduce that probability that's being factored into Russian calculations. Not a satisfying answer, but I would definitely be trying to say that to the president if I was given half a chance to do it, beyond the kind of the warning and the probability indexes that we normally use.
If we were at the Nick or in the Kennedy School, I imagine Joe would want to follow up, but he will not have the opportunity here, unfortunately. Sam, let's go to the next question.
Our next question is a written submission from Dan O'Connell, who asks, what expectations should the international community have for China's role in ending this conflict?
Let's Sam, let me have you take a crack at that, and then Andriy, let me also briefly have you give your sense of what this looks like from the Ukrainian government's perspective.
Well, I think expectations should be low, but nonetheless, the fact that that the Chinese were willing to sort of throw their hat in the ring with this so-called peace plan, as unsatisfactory as it was, and having an envoy who went around to relevant capitals to discuss this issue. That I think you can use that their at least engagement on this to potentially Ukraine's advantage, particularly given the fact that the Chinese have more leverage with the Russians than any other international actor. So if you can get China to be invested in an outcome that's satisfactory to other key parties, particularly Ukraine, and have them be in a position to use their clout with the Russians, that would be a positive way of taking, of using China's engagement on this. But frankly, my expectations are somewhat low. I think there were a lot of instrumental motives behind the outreach, given that the Chinese were trying to burnish their image with the Europeans and put some distance between them, at least in the sort of public perception arena between them and the Russians. But nonetheless, it's, you should have to, in a situation like this, take advantage of anyone's interest in, even if it's just for show.
Andre, do you see any potential constructive outcome from Chinese engagement?
I will be very brief. Currently, they technically have a neutral position. However, they did not condemn Russian actions. They have not recognized a whole number of quite obvious events. And Russia is buying a lot of parts and elements through China, or with Chinese approval, which basically, from this perspective, they bypassing the Western sanctions and they are increasing their capabilities, which is very concerning. So I would stop on that, since
Sam, let's go to another question.
Our next question is from Nyla Risk. Ms. Risk, if you can unmute your microphone. It seems like we're having technical difficulties with hers, so our next question will be from Kili Bohili Svogbo.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for this discussion. The European Court of Human Rights is investigating human rights abuses through September of last year. The International Criminal Court is considering atrocity crimes, including the mentioned illegal deportation of children. But no tribunal has jurisdiction to criminally prosecute the crime of aggression in this instance, which is at the center of the war. How likely do you think an ad hoc tribunal on this specific crime is?
Great question. Fiona, do you want to take that, or Andre? Good to both of you.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Andre would probably have some things to say about this, because obviously the Ukrainian government has been pressing this hard and asking for different mechanisms, particularly to reflect what Kali Bohili has said, which is because it's very difficult to do this in this current frame. I mean, the ICC has already noted is looking at this actively on a very specific set of cases. And of course, the Russian government has even made public statements underscoring the fact that they have taken large numbers of Ukrainian children, even in excess of those that have fallen into the case at the ICC. But I think Andre should really speak to this, because this is really part of Ukraine's outreach at the moment.
Yeah, well, again, this is a specialist matter. There's a whole number of experts from all countries around the world participating in this. There's a massive legal talent working on this. From particularly, I know some people from UK with a very serious experience. So I'm sure that whatever the combined effort of the expertise can come up with, I mean, they already came and they're already coming up with some specific resolutions. There's no straightforward answer, so there must be some compromise made, meaning that they would have to choose a certain framework, which yes, have some risks of acceptance by everybody. But if we have a universal recognition of that, then that would work. And I guess we're already very close to some consensus, or at least a majority consensus on how this is going to look like. And as soon as that happens, the materials which they collected are enormous. I mean, there's like a lot of experts working on the ground collecting human rights abuses. So there will be a massive legal process coming up soon.
Sam, let's go to another question.
Our next question is a written submission from Sebastian Litch, who asks, during the past months, we have seen strong leadership by President Biden within NATO, rallying its members in support of Ukraine, both militarily, financially, and from a security perspective. Considering the upcoming U.S. presidential election in 2024, how might its outcome alter the U.S. position regarding the support of Ukraine within NATO and consequently impact the outcome of the war?
It's a great question. Fiona, why don't we start with you, and then Sam, I'll let you react to that as well.
Yeah, I had a feeling you might start with me. I was also looking down a lot of the questions, and I can, see that a lot of other people have also asked the same question about, is Putin waiting for 2024? Look, he clearly is. And it's not just a question about the US presidential election, just for, kind of larger framing. I mean, technically, Ukraine has to have a presidential election there, but I mean, obviously under wartime and extremist circumstances, that's very difficult, but so does Putin, we have to remember, right? So technically, Putin is supposed to have an election earlier in 2024 than the US presidential election, but of course, the US campaign is already underway. There are also likely to be changes in Europe, which Putin is factoring in. So it's not just about waiting to see if Trump is going to come back in the United States. He's looking to see what might happen in France with Marine Le Pen, the possibility of, her emerging as Macron, basically can't continue in the presidency for, an advanced term. We have elections in Germany, in 3 key states, in Thuringia, Saxony, and Brandenburg, where the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, might emerge. Putin is basically betting that across the board there will be sufficient changes in the United States and in Europe that will undercut the support for Ukraine. Big bet, obviously, on Trump. Be watching, things very closely. President Trump, of course, has bragged that he could, solve the whole, Ukraine conflict, as he puts it, overnight. I think, his track record on this is very clear, that he doesn't take Ukraine or the war or any of these things seriously. And, that there would obviously be a major jolt, not just with him becoming or at least being right now the presumptive Republican candidate, but as the campaign unfolds. So I think the message from all of this, not just for Ukraine, obviously, but for Europeans, and it's a message that I'm trying to spread while I'm actually here in Europe, is to, make Europe and NATO's and all the other institutional positions very clear now. Because the outcome of this does not only solely depend on the United States. And I think other countries that have a vested interest in a resolution of this war in a way that doesn't just pander to Putin's aims, really need to take a stance now about why this is important and to continue their military and diplomatic support for Ukraine as well. I mean, if we know that Putin is waiting, for 2024, well, it's still, some time out. Let's take some action now while we can.
Sam, is Putin making a good bet here?
Well, I wouldn't speculate on the outcome of our presidential election, about which, I think there's a lot to still unfold. But, I think the very fact that this has become such an important factor in the thinking of both U.S. allies about U.S. staying power and plausibly, at least, in Russian thinking about, their own timeframes for potentially ending the conflict, I think is telling. The question is the fact that Putin might be thinking that he could be dealing with a much easier interlocutor after the U.S. elections a motivating factor for us, or a factor that we should, be trying to somehow address in some other way? And here, there aren't any easy outs, but it does, underscore, I think, the extent to which, you hear this question in European capitals a lot regarding the future of U.S. policy on this issue, and actually regarding the war as a whole, that this is sort of one of these exogenous factors that could have a major impact on the outcome.
Andre, let me close with you quickly, not by having you try to offer commentary on American or European politics, but to get to this question of staying power from the Ukrainian perspective. If we are, in fact, as many commentators suggest, and you seem to allow as a possibility, looking at a war that will continue for some time, what are the challenges to Ukraine of sustaining that, given the incredible costs, the ammunition used, everything else? that you are seeing with your own eyes? What will determine whether Ukraine can stay the course in a long war?
Ukraine will stay the course, whatever happens, simply because we don't have any better alternative. We are absolutely determined because there's nothing which is worse than Russian occupation. And we've seen that already, and that's why we will be fighting whatever it takes. And of course, then there are questions of the resources, there are questions of the economy support, there are questions of the continuous shelling of the critical infrastructure. We believe that Russians will try to do this again this winter. And so on and so on. So for sure, we are not interested in war taking as longer than absolutely necessary, because again, there would be changing politicians in the various countries. There would be constant discussions of the so-called fatigue. There will be literal shortages of ammunition and the shortages of the weapons and so on and so on. We know about all that. I mean, military analysis are very clear about that. The world wasn't ready for that war. Not psychologically, not materially. So we are against the time. But again, there's absolutely no better chance for us than to win it, because simply Russian strategy is very clear, and our strategy is just is to save our country. That's pretty much as simple as that.
We will end on that note.
大家好，我是华尔街电视的小安，为大家主持一档新的节目《亚洲大眼睛》。那什么样的内容，您慢慢看就知道了。反诈题材电影孤注一掷，成功引起了人们对跨境电信网络诈骗的热议。那其实近年来，我们常看到利用高薪诱骗他人去境外从事电信网络诈骗的新闻。那无疑，电诈已经成为了新型犯罪的主要毒瘤。那根据统计，缅北地区现有超过10万人从事电信网络诈骗。那究竟缅北是如何沦为诈骗温床的呢？中国又将对境外电诈如何治理？那这一期的亚洲大眼睛带您一起来探讨。缅甸北部是一个怎么样的地方？是前几年网络流行的天堂，还是现在电信诈骗天堂？那近期中国和缅甸政府都释放出将重拳打击缅北电信诈骗的信号。2023年8月15日至16日，中泰缅老4国警方启动专项联合行动，严厉打击本区域电信网络诈骗和网络赌博犯罪。专家就表示，就现实而言，想要根治境外电信网络诈骗，可能还有一段较长的路要走。只有打击预防双管齐下，才能彻底铲除电诈犯罪土壤。那缅北地处中缅边界，边境线长达2000多公里。那由于地理、历史、民族、政治等多重复杂因素，缅北地区各方实力割据。这里曾经是臭名远昭的金三角毒窟，近年来又沦为电信网络诈骗的人间炼狱。在臭名远著的 KK 院区所在的缅东苗瓦底，这里至少有2股实力强大的武装力量，他们是从克伦民族联盟分裂的克伦佛教军和克伦基督军，也叫克伦边防军和克伦民族解放军，分别都有自己的地盘。其中克伦基督军与缅军政府冲突不断，克伦佛教军则被缅军收编后，如今成为了当地的克伦边防军。那根据知情人士向澎湃新闻透露， KK 院区正是克伦边防军的实力范围，后者为其提供庇护。那就在不久前，该院区周边克伦基督军和缅政府军及克伦边防军激烈交火，反复发生枪战。在苗瓦底水沟谷， KK 院区只是其中一个较为知名的电诈院区，除此之外还有钻石院区、福利院区、大象院区、凤凰院区等近20个院区，里面入驻的都是搞电诈的公司。苗瓦底一个小镇，电诈人员最多时30万人左右，至今还有约9万人还在那边。那从苗瓦底沿着泰缅边境一路向北，至泰国美赛、缅甸掸班大其力的接壤处，这里是金三角的核心地带。曾经的大毒枭坤沙、诺康在此割据一方。大其力尽管属于缅甸军政府的实力范围，但各种民兵团盘根错节，也是如今金三角地区最不安全的地带之一。自今年的5月7日起，当地政府宣布大其力执行限外令，禁止任何外国人前往大其力。那近年来， 在中国国内对电信网络诈骗持续保持高压的态势下，缅北成为了更多犯罪分子聚集之地。那为什么缅北会成为犯罪的温床呢？因为在地理位置上，其北部与中国接壤，西部则与印度孟加拉国相邻，东部与老挝泰国毗邻，南部则毗邻安达曼海。而在这个与多国接壤的小国家中，民族问题极端复杂，各民族之间互不承认，甚至不承认缅甸官方的领导。那因此各地长期军阀混战达70多年，至今都没能消除。而这种混乱看似只是在国家内部的民族问题，但实际上已经相当于国中国之间的混战。那各地不仅可以拥有自己的武装力量，甚至还有自治权。而混乱中心的缅北更加可怕，缅甸官方命令禁止外国人进入，但惨案依旧不断发生，这就是缅甸北部的真实现状。那昆明反电信网络诈骗中心17日在公开信息警示中，近年来境外实施的电信诈骗案件频发，使用境外电话占最大宗。根据昆明市反电信网络诈骗中心统计，2022年1月至12月，全市涉及00号段境外号码实施电诈骗案件，那占总案件数的 21.6%。2023年以来已经占 14%。那以号召统计全市市民在无境外业务情况下关闭境外电话功能。玉溪市公安局反诈骗中心早前也在公开信函中指出，被困境外的中国公民被强行安排到诈骗窝点，从事电信网络诈骗等违法犯罪活动，人身受到限制，每天必须完成高额的诈骗任务，任务不成的轻则断食，重则被电击、殴打等等。如果想要回国，则需缴纳巨额的赔款和赎金。如果不交钱又不完成任务的话，屁股受尽辛苦，甚至有生命危险。那包山市公安局反诈骗中心公开信也指出，被安排到诈骗窝点后，如果想要回国，不仅需要赔偿路费、偷渡费、住宿伙食费，还需要缴纳少则人民币几万，多则几十万、上百万的赎金。更多甚者，如果不交钱又无法完成诈骗业绩任务，轻总部像猪仔被转卖至其他诈骗窝点，重则受尽折磨，甚至有生命危险。那究竟一旦不小心坠入缅北骗局，受害者将受到怎么样的凌辱呢？在火爆的短视频平台中，不时会有利用年轻人的视频，视频里大吹特吹缅北如何的安全，如何的好，还现身说法，说什么电诈、嘎腰子的根本就是不存在的事。那更有美女小姐姐出镜告诉你，这里不但有秀丽的风光，还有高薪的工作和无限美好的人生机会。主打的是一个只要去了缅北就可以直接登上人生巅峰，迎娶白富美一样。但事实上，缅北其实很贫穷，普通人工资待遇在人民币2000块左右，高薪只是在画大饼。不过一旦你有意识前往缅北工作，对方会帮你准备好机票，让你在1分钱都不用花的情况下，就可以出国体验生活。那骗子的手法基本上有2种。根据消息指出，骗子们的操作手法分成2种，在缅北的放得开，直接放高薪招聘，引诱人上当；在国内的就是公司福利好，则一入职就安排东南亚旅游。一般情况下，他们提供的机票不会是直飞，而是飞到边境或是泰国等地方，这也是分辨他们骗术的方法之一。那等到了边境之后，就会有蛇头把人带到边境上的安全屋，电诈集团或是院区就可以领人了。那一些年轻人在网络上看到日薪3000、月薪5万、年入7位数的信息后，铤而走险，期待一夜暴富。殊不知，这正是他们的噩梦的开始。丧失自由只是轻的处罚，辱骂、恐吓、鞭打堪称家常便饭，想要全身而退更是难上加难啊！重压之下，无论是否自愿，多数人只能沦为帮凶。他们开始在网络上扮演投资指导老师、公务人员、物流客服等各种角色，按照既定的话术骗取他人信任，进而实施诈骗。那据说电诈公司的老板多为中国人，来自中国东南某省份的居多。这些老板携带大量的资金，他们购买快递、建房、租赁办公场地、投入设备、人力等等。 当地的武装力量则以占干股的形式与他们分成，并为他们提供安保庇护。他们毫无底线，对待同胞更是狠之又狠。不过他们一般不直接嘎腰子，这并不是他们有多人性，而是技术其实还不行，这得再把人卖一次到其他国家。那接下来我们一起来分享一些真实的案例。根据媒体报道，2022年9月，身家千万的贵州某旅行社老板姓魏林，因亲信在高铁上认识的旅游同行，直接乘坐飞机飞往曼谷考察旅游环境谈合作。下机后抵不住合作对象的热情，他推掉此前安排好的行数，踏上对方安排的车辆。没想到随后他就被烟雾迷晕并绑架，卖到泰缅界河对岸的苗瓦底地区，被迫从事电信诈骗。被骗的3个多月里，为了早日逃离魔爪，姓威林曾跳下5米高墙，身上多次骨折，后渡河入境泰国，几经转折，终于在今年的1月5日回到云南昆明。从某种程度来说，死里逃生的他是幸运的，还有更多不幸的人仍在这个魔窟苦苦挣扎。2023年3月16日晚上，大其力的一家超市的女员工被持枪人员切齿后，用中文大喊：“我有2个小孩，我不能跟你走。”视频在国内的社交媒体广泛传播，引发关注。那中国驻缅甸大使馆还为此发声。那2023年4月，驻缅甸大使馆营救了一名被骗至大其力从事电诈活动的中国公民，其遭受殴打拘禁，生命安全受到威胁。那甚至在最近1个月内还发现了17具尸体。那前段时间十分流行的缅甸变装挑战，让缅北瞬间成为许多人心中的梦幻之地。许多人开始对这个充满危险的地方抱有幻想，但真实的缅北却让人不寒而栗。根据缅甸官方统计，缅北木姐镇过去1个月的时间内就发现了17具的尸体。那这些遗体被随意丢弃在公路野外，没有人知道他们的真实身份，也没有人来认领这些遗体。1个月内17人被害，如此密集的凶杀，无论在哪个国家都令人难以置信，但在缅北这却很常见。那在缅北人命有多不值钱，被随意弃尸野外无人认领不是最可怕的，可怕的是在这些罪犯眼中，你根本不算个人。根据亲身经历者的叙述来看，网络上对缅北的包装完全是假象。到了缅北一般只有1个下场，那就是被虐待、被迫犯罪。缅北地区有很多不受当局管束的军阀，这些军阀为了保证军力，开始用犯罪谋取利益。那些被骗或者被抓走的人，往往都会遭到残忍的毒打，刀和钢管直接落在身上，甚至直接插进膝盖，还有的被拔掉牙齿和指甲，甚至手脚筋也被挑断。如果不肯听话，那么就直接被杀害。这些缅北军阀根本不会手下留情，而真实情况也远比想象中残酷。那外国的中国留学生也成为了诈骗的新目标。在缅甸生活10年，目前在缅甸经商的中国人 A 先生对缅北电诈情况有一定的了解。A 先生表示，现在流行的是以高薪诱骗，等人到了以后再限制人身自由，让家属拿钱赎人。此外，他还提到，在外国的中国留学生现在成为了诈骗的新目标，因为留学生在国外生活，对于国内信息掌握不一定及时，所以他们对于诈骗电话的警惕性可能没有那么高。诈骗集团现在会找外语非常流利、文化知识水平较高的人员来从事电诈。A 先生就说，你想一下，一个在海外的留学生接到电话，对方一口流利的英语和标准的普通话，是不是更具有欺骗性？那大部分宣称自己被骗去缅北的人其实是自愿的。一位长期从事反电诈、境外劝返解救的警察表示，近年来陷入电诈院区的人，绝大部分是自愿过去的，回来就讲自己被骗。那在百度贴吧、出国吧里，存在大量希望被带出国发财的求职者，这其中有一部分明知电诈院区的风险，依然抱着侥幸的心态盼出国捞金。目前中国警方对赴缅人群的安全宣讲和检查都很严格和全面。社区警察在得知对方将飞往缅甸之后，会打电话向对方进行安全宣讲以及核查。那在去往缅甸的飞机起飞之前，还有警察进行3次的排查。但显然，这依然无法阻止被高薪利诱的年轻人送羊入虎口。 那最近缅北的诈骗是越来越猖狂，猖狂在于诈骗集团会庆祝及公告他们的诈骗行为。那夜幕降临时，缅甸佤邦蒙博的夜空会不定时的燃放起礼花，燃放的时间越久，意味着这一次的诈骗到手的钱就越多。在境外工作的陈翔第一次看到时并不稀奇，而接着看到燃放的礼花让他好奇。经他了解得知，按惯例，只要50万以上的单子诈骗成功，电诈院区里就会燃放礼花以示庆祝。那你只要数一数声响，你就会知道一单是50万成功了。那目前根据新华社仰光7月25日的报道，中国驻缅甸大使陈海在内比都会见缅甸外长丹税，双方就中缅合作打击缅境内电诈、网赌等犯罪活动进行专题协调。陈海就指出，针对缅甸边境地区电信诈骗犯罪活动蔓延，中缅双方及中缅泰三方开展联合打击行动，取得初步的成效。尽管如此，包括缅北在内的缅甸边境地区电信诈骗活动依然猖獗，严重损害了中缅两国民众切身利益。双方应进一步采取有力的措施，同其他相关邻国合力开展新一阶段联合打击行动，全力铲除电信诈骗窝点，解救被困中方人员，根除缅甸境内诈赌毒瘤，将犯罪势力及其组织人员绳之以法，维护中缅友好合作大局。丹税就表示，缅方高度重视中方关切，缅中双方近期多次就此进行协调。那总的来说，缅北的问题由来已久，一时难以解决。我们大家在平时还是要做好警惕，保护好自己的安全，不要随便接陌生的电话，更不要轻信别人。那相信在三国的联合打击下，缅北的诈骗集团可以受到重创。那还这里的地区环境一个清明，同时也希望被困在那里的人可以早日重见光明。那谢谢大家，这就是第2期亚洲大眼睛，希望听到您的意见，留言在节目的下方。
突发消息，一架载有军阀叶夫根尼·普里戈津 Yevgeny Prigozhin 的飞机在从莫斯科飞往圣彼得堡的途中坠毁。据俄新社报道，俄罗斯紧急情况部称，飞机上包括3名机组人员在内的10人全部遇难。俄罗斯官员称，乘客中有一名与普里戈津同名的男子，但未做进一步说明。法新社8月23日周三引述多家媒体报道，曾负责进攻乌克兰的俄罗斯将军谢尔盖·苏罗维金 Sergei Surovikin 在瓦格纳叛乱2个月后被解除了航空航天部队总司令的职务。他被认为与瓦格纳关系密切。据俄罗斯国家通讯社 RIA Novosti 周三援引熟悉军队内情的消息来源称，陆军上将谢尔盖·苏罗维金已被解职。据俄罗斯卫星通讯社报道，现年56岁的苏罗维金的职务已被维克托·阿夫扎罗夫 Viktor Exelov 将军接替。克里姆林宫和俄罗斯国防部都没有立即发布任何公告，而军队内部的变动往往在暗中进行。然而，俄罗斯日报 RBK 和莫斯科回声电台的前主编维内迪克托夫 Alexei Benediktov 宣布了苏罗维金上将被解职的消息。另外，报道乌克兰战事的有影响力的军事博主瑞巴尔 Rybar 也宣布了这个消息。苏罗维金因手段残忍而被称为世界末日将军，是俄罗斯军事干预乌克兰的主要指挥官之一。此前，他曾得到瓦格纳老板普里戈津和车臣领导人卡德罗夫的公开支持和赞扬。自瓦格纳的叛乱于6月底结束以来，一直有关于俄罗斯军事指挥部改组的传闻，特别是关于谢尔盖·苏罗维金的传闻。瓦格纳雇佣军集团24小时的叛乱震动了俄国当局，在此期间，苏罗维金呼吁兵变者停止，尽快返回军营。但这位将军被认为与瓦格纳及其领导人叶夫根尼·普里戈津关系密切。2022年10月，苏罗维金被任命为俄军驻乌克兰部队指挥官。次年11月，他不得不下令撤出赫尔松镇和第聂伯河右岸南岸，这对莫斯科来说是一次耻辱性的失败。他在上任仅3个月后就被俄罗斯参谋长格拉西莫夫取代。谢尔盖·苏罗维金作为苏联阿富汗战争和2000年代第2次车臣战争的老兵，还参加了2015年俄罗斯在叙利亚的残酷战役，这为他赢得了叙利亚屠夫的绰号。普里戈津及其瓦格纳集团的影响力究竟有多大？瓦格纳集团因在战场上的残酷杀害和野蛮战术而臭名昭著。在据称处决叛逃到乌克兰的武装分子的视频中，该组织还展示了其在战场外的冷酷无情。据报道，瓦格纳去年用大铁锤处决了一名叛逃者，随后他将大铁锤图标纳入其标志。普里戈津于1961年出生于当时的列宁格勒， 及现在的圣彼得堡。据报道，普里戈津在20多岁的时候，因抢劫罪和欺诈罪在苏联监狱服刑9年。出狱的时候，苏联解体了，普里戈津走上了创业之路。他在家乡做热狗食品车开始，后来转向更大的项目，例如圣彼得堡开了一家豪华餐厅。该餐厅成为俄罗斯精英的聚集中心，其中包括当时的圣彼得堡副市长普京。得益于与政治精英的密切联系，普里戈津的业务在普京就任总统后进一步扩张。他的餐饮公司康科德 Concord 成立于20世纪90年代，获得了独家且利润丰厚的国宴合同，其中包括普京的就职典礼餐饮和美国总统布什访问圣彼得堡的宴席。这些合同为普里戈津赢得了普京厨师的称号。不过，普里戈津的野心并没有局限于餐饮业。2023年2月14日，普里戈津承认他是一家互联网研究机构的幕后黑手，该机构是广为人知的巨魔工厂网络。据 FBI 称，该机构组织网络水军，发起了广泛的虚假信息散播活动，用以影响2016年美国总统选举的结果。普里戈津和他的律师此前曾强烈否认这些指控，还对报道他与俄罗斯巨魔工厂之间关系的记者提起法律诉讼。2014年，普里戈津成立了私营军事公司瓦格纳集团。与巨魔工厂一样，他长期以来一直否认与该组织有任何关系，直到2022年9月，他公开承认此事。俄罗斯独立分析师普罗科彭科 Alexander Prokopenko 告诉德国之声，普里戈津的雇佣兵组织为普京提供灰色服务，他让他的老板及其同党在他们不想公开和正式参与的地区政治中如鱼得水。普罗科彭科说，例如在乌克兰的顿涅茨克和卢甘斯克地区，以及非洲和叙利亚，瓦格纳雇佣兵不仅参加了战斗行动，还守卫了一些石油设施。突发消息，一架载有军阀叶夫根尼·普里戈津 Yevgeny Prigozhin 的飞机在从莫斯科飞往圣彼得堡的途中坠毁。据俄新社报道，俄罗斯紧急情况部称，飞机上包括3名机组人员在内的10人全部遇难。俄罗斯官员称，乘客中有一名与普里戈津同名的男子，但未做进一步说明。法新社8月23日周三引述多家媒体报道，曾负责进攻乌克兰的俄罗斯将军谢尔盖·苏罗维金 Sergei Surovikin 在瓦格纳叛乱2个月后被解除了航空航天部队总司令的职务。他被认为与瓦格纳关系密切。据俄罗斯国家通讯社 RIA Novosti 周三援引熟悉军队内情的消息来源称，陆军上将谢尔盖·苏罗维金已被解职。据俄罗斯卫星通讯社报道，现年56岁的苏罗维金的职务已被维克托·阿夫扎罗夫 Viktor Evselov 将军接替。克里姆林宫和俄罗斯国防部都没有立即发布任何公告，而军队内部的变动往往在暗中进行。然而，俄罗斯日报 RBK 和莫斯科回声电台的前主编维内迪克托夫 Alexei Venediktov 宣布了苏罗维金上将被解职的消息。另外，报道乌克兰战事的有影响力的军事博主瑞巴尔 Rybar 也宣布了这个消息。苏罗维金因手段残忍而被称为世界末日将军，是俄罗斯军事干预乌克兰的主要指挥官之一。此前，他曾得到瓦格纳老板普里戈津和车臣领导人卡德罗夫的公开支持和赞扬。自瓦格纳的叛乱于6月底结束以来，一直有关于俄罗斯军事指挥部改组的传闻，特别是关于谢尔盖·苏罗维金的传闻。瓦格纳雇佣军集团24小时的叛乱震动了俄国当局，在此期间，苏罗维金呼吁兵变者停止，尽快返回军营。但这位将军被认为与瓦格纳及其领导人叶夫根尼·普里戈津关系密切。2022年10月，苏罗维金被任命为俄军驻乌克兰部队指挥官。次年11月，他不得不下令撤出赫尔松镇和第聂伯河右岸、南岸，这对莫斯科来说是一次耻辱性的失败。他在上任仅3个月后就被俄罗斯参谋长格拉西莫夫取代。谢尔盖·苏罗维金作为苏联阿富汗战争和2000年代第2次车臣战争的老兵，还参加了2015年俄罗斯在叙利亚的残酷战役，这为他赢得了叙利亚屠夫的绰号。普里戈津及其瓦格纳集团的影响力究竟有多大？瓦格纳集团因在战场上的残酷杀害和野蛮战术而臭名昭著。在据称处决叛逃到乌克兰的武装分子的视频中，该组织还展示了其在战场外的冷酷无情。据报道，瓦格纳去年用大铁锤处决了一名叛逃者，随后他将大铁锤图标纳入其标志。普里戈津于1961年出生于当时的列宁格勒及现在的圣彼得堡。据报道，普里戈津在20多岁的时候，因抢劫罪和欺诈罪在苏联监狱服刑9年。出狱的时候，苏联解体了，普里戈津走上了创业之路。他在家乡做热狗食品车开始，后来转向更大的项目，例如圣彼得堡开了一家豪华餐厅。该餐厅成为俄罗斯精英的聚集中心，其中包括当时的圣彼得堡副市长普京。 得益于与政治精英的密切联系，普里戈津的业务在普京就任总统后进一步扩张。他的餐饮公司康科德 （Concord） 成立于20世纪90年代，获得了独家且利润丰厚的国宴合同，其中包括普京的就职典礼餐饮和美国总统布什访问圣彼得堡的宴席。这些合同为普里戈津赢得了普京厨师的称号。不过，普里戈津的野心并没有局限于餐饮业。2023年2月14日，普里戈津承认他是一家互联网研究机构的幕后黑手，该机构是广为人知的巨魔工厂网络。据 FBI 称，该机构组织网络水军，发起了广泛的虚假信息散播活动，用以影响2016年美国总统选举的结果。普里戈津和他的律师此前曾强烈否认这些指控，还对报道他与俄罗斯巨魔工厂之间关系的记者提起法律诉讼。2014年，普里戈津成立了私营军事公司瓦格纳集团。与巨魔工厂一样，他长期以来一直否认与该组织有任何关系，直到2022年9月，他公开承认此事。俄罗斯独立分析师普罗科彭科 （Alexander Prokopenko） 告诉德国之声，普里戈津的雇佣兵组织为普京提供灰色服务。他让他的老板及其同党在他们不想公开和正式参与的地区政治中如鱼得水。普罗科彭科说，例如在乌克兰的顿涅茨克和卢甘斯克地区，以及非洲和叙利亚，瓦格纳雇佣兵不仅参加了战斗行动，还守卫了一些石油设施。
Prigozhin, the Russian oligarch and head of the Wagner Group, marched his forces on Moscow in an apparent attempt at overthrowing the leadership of the Russian military and Ministry of Defense, or at the very least, just putting on a big show of it. Prigozhin's forces were barreling towards Moscow when it was announced that his mutiny would be called off. Prigozhin would travel to Belarus. There was an apparent deal in the works with the Kremlin. We've just had Vladimir Putin take to the airwaves to announce that deal would be respected, but then also announce sort of very threatening words to others that were potentially contemplating similar mutinies. There's lots to discuss, and I have a great group here with me. Before I introduce them, let me first say, I want everyone to please pick up your phone, and you should subscribe to our podcast, The Russian Roulette, where we talk about all these issues, as well as our sister podcast, The Europhile, where we talk a lot about these issues from more of a European lens. But let me turn to our panelists. First, to my left is Maria Snegovaya, Senior Fellow here at the Europe-Russia-Eurasia Program. And then Jeff Mankoff, Senior Associate with our program here at CSIS, and a Distinguished Research Fellow at the National Defense University, and Katrina Doxey, Associate Director and Associate Fellow with the Transnational Threats Projects here at CSIS as well. Thank you all for being here. I think we first need to just address the major question of what happened. How do we describe what happened, and maybe sort of a state of play? Maybe Katrina, I'll start with you on that. And how would you describe what was Yevgeny Prigozhin thinking? What was the intention? What was the motivation behind what we all witnessed beginning on Friday night and over the weekend?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I will preface all of this by saying it's something that I'm continuing to grapple with. I think everyone is still trying to understand. We still don't have full information of what has happened, certainly not what's in the works now, what people are thinking. But really, I think it comes down to a mix of overconfidence and miscalculation. Prigozhin is the leader of the Wagner Group, which, as everyone knows, is a private military company that is not so private. It's a quasi-independent company that is closely linked to the Russian government. Russia has long used it since its formation in 2014, actually in the context of the previous invasion of Ukraine. Moscow has used it to carry out various objectives abroad, typically spreading Moscow's geopolitical interests, expanding military and intelligence power projection, and securing economic gains. This has been strongest in recent years in places like sub-Saharan Africa, countries like the Central African Republic, Sudan, Mali, Madagascar, where Wagner typically exchanges its paramilitary and security services for access to natural resources like gold and gemstones. With the latest invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Prigozhin brought Wagner in first as more of this paramilitary force, then as almost an informal unit of the Russian military actually serving on the front lines in the area around Bakhmut. And over the past year, we've seen him become more forthcoming that he is indeed affiliated with Wagner. They opened a headquarters in Russia, and he's gotten into spat after spat with those in the Ministry of Defense very publicly. We believe that Putin has largely allowed this competition between Prigozhin and people like Shoigu and Gerasimov in the Ministry of Defense to go on as a way of sort of playing different sides against one another so that they can all be kept in check without Putin having to come out and outwardly scold any one of them, particularly as Russia navigates a wide range of failures in Ukraine. However, this has escalated over the past month because the Ministry of Defense gave Prigozhin and the Wagner Group a July 1st deadline, after which all members of Wagner would have to sign contracts to actually become formal parts of the military, no longer operating in this quasi-independent state. And that to Prigozhin read as an existential threat. That was the line he wasn't willing to cross, he wasn't willing to risk. And so, under the claimed motivation of responding to a Russian strike on a Wagner camp, something that we still don't have independent evidence corroborating that it actually happened, we had Prigozhin lead a group of Wagner soldiers toward Moscow. We saw them overtake cities, towns, military headquarter locations as they continued forward. The deal that was ultimately brokered with Putin involved terms that would allow Prigozhin and those who had participated in this march to remain independent, to not have to sign on to these contracts, and they would go to Belarus. Other members of Wagner would still have the option of signing on with the Ministry of Defense if they wanted to. Also, in all of this, Putin came out with incredibly strong language against Prigozhin, comparing the situation to the 1917 revolution, condemning Prigozhin, opening cases against him with the judicial and intelligence system, and then apparently walked that back in what was a relatively lenient set of terms, at least what's been made public in this agreement. That's been very confusing. It's yet another of these signs of weakness that we're seeing from Putin across all of this, combined with the fact that Wagner was able to so easily advance toward Moscow, in many cases with photographs and video just showing police officers just standing by and letting them go because they hadn't been ordered to act against them. This about face from Putin is very confusing. And to me, at least, it's clear that this isn't over. So we have Prigozhin and his core group of Wagner troops that had been in Russia told they can go to Belarus. They won't be prosecuted. They'll be excused because of their service in Ukraine. But we also had rumors coming out today that that criminal case against Prigozhin is not actually closed. It's still open, so Putin's keeping some leverage. He came out this afternoon with very strong language condemning what had been done, potentially, as you're saying, to stem any copycats. But even though the violent situation targeting Moscow has, for now at least, ended, the battle for control of Wagner has only just begun. Because, as I mentioned, the core of Wagner's operations aren't in Ukraine. In fact, it appears that Prigozhin has been looking for an excuse to draw down his presence in Ukraine as they continue to face failures, tension with the Ministry of Defense, and now the Ukrainian counteroffensive, with the bulk of those operations really being in Africa and other locations where he's built his business empire, and which he doesn't want to give up. He wants to retain control of all that. But because Wagner has been so instrumental in spreading Moscow's geopolitical interests, in helping them to evade sanctions, blunting the impact by giving them raw goods that they can then bring into unregulated markets to get money in the wake of all of the sanctions levied against them, Moscow's not going to let all of those companies go without a fight either.
No, that's thank you. That's a fantastic overview, and I think we'll get to kind of what this means for Wagner. I think maybe later in the conversation, but I think you really hit on the point that this is both about business in terms of for Prigozhin and power and his position within sort of the Russian elite. Maria, maybe let me turn to you. So, I mean, part of me thinks that Prigozhin thought here that he was sort of just doing a protest by sort of marching in, seizing Rostov. But it was a protest that had real consequences when you had the death of at least 13 Russian pilots that were, and 6 helicopters that were lost. But that he thought he was sort of doing a demonstration. But it's clear that Putin, in his reaction to it, when he came out and did a national address, and as Katrina mentioned, mentions 1917 and treats this as if it's a coup, that Putin treated it as a coup. Do you just think this was sort of Prigozhin got a little, lost common sense, as Putin described it in his recent televised address?
I think there are a lot of moving parts here, and we only, with our limited information that we possess, have a very constrained understanding of what is actually going on. To the extent that's possible to make sense of what's going on, I think Prigozhin is quite consistently, including his message earlier today, presenting this as really this attempt to draw attention of the authorities to this situation that's going on and the threat under which Wagner found itself being demolished, destroyed by MOD. Having said that, it's also not very clear what exactly he was trying to achieve by marching towards Moscow. It's hard to imagine that would be seen as a very good idea, right? Nice idea by Putin and his elites. One of the reasons is this is really the major, probably the largest crisis Putin has ever faced throughout over 23 years of his rule. And indeed so, because the power vertical that Putin has built is based on the assumption that it's a power vertical, it's strong, it's unique, and nobody dares to challenge it. And here you have a military contractor marching across Russia facing zero resistance and unilaterally inflicting more damage to Russian forces than Ukrainian army, no offense to Ukrainians and their courage, did maybe in several weeks. So that is certainly a huge exposure of the weaknesses of Russia. And the big question is, right now that most people are discussing, is what does it mean for Putin going forward, now that we see that the emperor has no clothes? And everybody is, well, not everybody, Wagner is to give them credit, is a very strong, very well-prepared, very trained force. But nonetheless, not in a state-level army, they can march all the way and reaching pretty much 120 miles to Russia's capital. So certainly the picture is pretty bad. Mike Kaufman posted on Twitter that Prigozhin's escapade might have been motivated by the sense of weakness that he consciously or subconsciously wanted to exploit, and at least partly he was right about it. Right, because indeed he exposed a lot of weaknesses in the system, that you can literally unilaterally occupy a million-plus city facing zero resistance. The elites will keep quiet. The security will sort of halfway join you. And the society would just have fun, right? You've seen a lot of Russians just cheering and having a good time against this armed man of Prigozhin. So essentially, I agree with Katrina completely. Maybe inadvertently, Prigozhin started a chain of the events that are extremely challenging for Putin, because he exposed the weakness. He undermined this perception on which Putin regime lasted of this power vertical strength and invincibility. They're all out in the window, and no wonder Putin is so upset and lashing out at Prigozhin. The question is it too late for Putin to really deal with this mess at this point?
Jeff, I'm over to you. I'm curious what your take is, if you agree with Maria's assessment here, that this really exposes kind of the weakness of the Kremlin. One sort of counter to that might be, well, we'll sort of see. On the one hand, Prigozhin clearly took advantage of the existing weakness, but then the response may matter quite a bit. And how do you see the kind of current situation playing out?
Yeah, that's right. So I think it's important to keep in mind that Prigozhin presented everything that he was doing, going back to his participation in the war in Ukraine, including the battle for Bakhmut, as being from a place of patriotism for Russia and loyalty to Putin. And so I don't see his attempted march on Moscow as designed to pose a threat to Putin himself. His targets were the defense minister, Shoigu, the chief of the general staff, Gerasimov, and the general way in which the war was being prosecuted. He's not a peace candidate by any stretch of the imagination. If anything, Prigozhin wanted the war to be fought more intensely and more capably, which he saw the current leadership of the defense ministry as incapable of doing. And I think he thought that by making this kind of show of force, he could perhaps force Putin's hand. He could force some kind of accommodation that would see concessions in terms of the leadership of the military, that would secure Wagner's continued existence within the Russian political system, avoiding this necessity of having them incorporated into the regular military. The problem with all of that is Putin didn't see it that way. Throughout Putin's 23 years in power, he's been very intent on preventing any kind of potential challenge from emerging. And I think it's almost inevitable that he would have seen the collection of forces under the leadership of somebody like Prigozhin as a potential threat. And I think that was part of the reason that Wagner was being starved of resources in the battle for Bakhmut, which led to a lot of the complaints that Prigozhin was making. I think that's why Putin resisted trying to intervene in the conflicts between Shoigu and Gerasimov on the one hand and Prigozhin on the other. And I think it's part of the reason that Putin ultimately agreed to the proposal by the defense ministry that Wagner be formally subordinated to the defense ministry with this July 1st deadline. So in that sense, I think Prigozhin misread what Putin was doing and what Putin's own threat perception was. And so having launched this campaign with the aim of forcing Putin to give some kind of concessions, I think when it became clear that Putin was not going to behave in the way that Prigozhin had hoped, that he actually came out and made a speech denouncing this as treason and a threat to the unity of the state, then Prigozhin wasn't left with a lot of great options. And so was forced to kind of take the deal that was being offered, which to some degree seems to have been brokered by Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, who played a very anomalous role in all of this. So in that sense, it looks like this was a defeat for Prigozhin. He is probably going to be, at the very least, isolated in Belarus. Wagner is, if not being completely dissolved and subordinated into the defense ministry, at least there seems to be an attempt to try and separate it from Prigozhin's leadership. And if you look at Putin's speech from a couple of hours ago, he was very clear to put the onus for all of this on Prigozhin and to talk about the patriotism and the loyalty of the individual Wagnerites, which I think is quite important. But it's also not a great look for Putin either, because as Maria said, if you look at the response of ordinary Russian citizens in Rostov, in Voronezh, and elsewhere to this incursion or mutiny or whatever you want to call it, they certainly didn't seem to oppose it. They didn't seem to be throwing themselves in front of the tanks to stop them from proceeding on the road towards Moscow. I was having a conversation on Twitter about this last night. If you compare the reaction of the Russian security services and ordinary Russian people with the way that the Turkish security services and Turkish people responded when there was an attempt to overthrow President Erdogan in 2016, it's very, very different. Then you had a popular upsurge of support. People actually came out and threw their bodies in front of the military columns and the tanks at great risk to themselves, and a number of people were killed in the process. You didn't see anything like that in Russia. Even among people who claim to be supporting the war and believe in the kind of sacredness of Putin himself. So in that sense, I think it's very damning as far as what it says about the level of legitimacy and support that Putin enjoys. Now, we'll see how he reacts. Certainly, he seems to have come down not as hard on Prigozhin and Wagner as perhaps he might have expected. And indeed, the very idea that you can lead an armed mutiny and then go enjoy a comfortable, or, well, an exile in Belarus suggests that Putin didn't have the capability to do anything more stronger against Prigozhin. Now, we'll see how long Prigozhin lasts. We'll see what happens to him. But certainly, even if that's the case, even if he does, fall out of a window or have a heart attack or something like that, the fact that it has to be done in the shadows rather than the fact that Putin could come out and demonstratively say, okay, this is unacceptable, you're going to jail, you're going to the lager, or you're, whatever is happening to you, is in and of itself a sign of weakness. And I think now, going forward, obviously the Kremlin is going to be very intent on preventing other actors from accumulating the kind of military power that Prigozhin accumulated. And there are other entities in Russia now that are forming similar paramilitary forces or private military companies. I'm sure there'll be a lot more focus on the potential threat that they pose. But at the same time, having shown up the sort of hollowness of the regime writ large, I think it's hard not to draw the conclusion that there are going to be other people who are going to seek to challenge it in various ways. Maybe not in a direct military sense the way that Prigozhin did, but in other ways, people whose loyalty is going to be more and more in question. And I think that in turn builds up the paranoia within the regime itself, which as it becomes more and more focused on the threat of internal instability, becomes less effective at actually running the country. And we haven't even talked about its effectiveness at running the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, I think that's a good topic to get to, but I think I want to sort of continue with the reaction inside of the Kremlin. I mean, I think your point about the Turkey coup and comparing it to, it sort of highlights why this probably shouldn't be called a coup. It was much more of a mutiny. Normally in a coup, your first effort is to really grab the microphone or the TV, state TV cameras to sort of proclaim that you're in charge. And Prigozhin didn't do that, and Putin ended up doing that. And it seemed, therefore, sort of like this bizarre, maybe kind of January 6th style protest, if you want to make a bad analogy, where it didn't quite seem as thought out in terms of what the final objective, yet it clearly caused panic, I would say, in the Kremlin when you start seeing highways being bulldozed to potentially stop the column, and real panic in Moscow and throughout Russia. I mean, was that, Maria, maybe just back to you, did you sense that panic amongst the Kremlin and
certainly.
Russians?
Well, we didn't just sense them, right? There was information of private jets flying out of Moscow. And there was also the usual indicator, the prices of airplane tickets to Turkey, Armenia, and they all skyrocketed. And the next day there were also a lot of jokes after it was over about how much people must have spent and how frustrated they must be now. But yeah, it's far from over. Maybe I'd not return the ticket just yet, because as we said, this might be just the beginning of this situation. I wanted to highlight the interesting quality of the Russian public opinion and the elites, that in a lot of ways, and this is why Putin is so upset probably about what's going on, in a lot of ways, this is not about commitment to values, real love to Putin, for Putin, etc. In a lot of ways, a Russian status quo in support of both the elites and the society is based on perception of the stability of the status quo. Who has the control? Who has power? Who is in control? Who is the big boss? And historically, Putin has been very successful in convening this perception, and this is also why FSB and the security services, the Siloviki, go at such paranoid fashion against any possible dissent, usually, right? Because they want to eliminate any possibility of disagreement and of challenge. And now this all has been completely destroyed. Just like that, without maybe necessarily having that intent. I'm not, again, I agree with Jeff here. I don't think that Prigozhin necessarily had that in mind. But that's certainly the perception that he completely destroyed. And this is why it's so dangerous. The public, the society, the elites, they've all taken a pause while all this has been unraveling. It's very particularly stunning is the silence of Margarita Simonyan, the notorious editor-in-chief of RT, who just disappeared from Telegram for a couple of days and then resurfaced saying that, oh, wow, sorry, guys, something happened. I was away. I'm sorry, on holiday, vacation.
Something happened.
I think this is exactly the response that will be happening shall a real challenge emerge to Putin, right? Nobody wants to stand up to his defense. Everybody's sitting, waiting patiently to see who will emerge as a winner of the situation. In other ways, the emperor has no clothes. He has no true support. He has no real elite or society willing to die. And maybe that may be wrong, because after all, Wagner was stopped. Whatever it was that was communicated to Prigozhin, there was something strong enough to make him back down, right? So probably Putin has some Siloviki forces on his side, but we're not sure anymore, right? That's certainly not what we used to think before. Even Friday last week, right? We probably would be much more confident about the support and Siloviki resource that Putin has at his side, and this is the image that has been destroyed. Essentially, the blood is in the water, and all the sharks are up there for all these assets, and there's a lot of assets to take part.
Right. Well, essentially, you know, for every elite, their power is dependent on Putin. So suddenly, if Putin looks weak, they have to be quite concerned. And Katrina, you brought up the 1917. You know, Putin mentioned 1917. I was frankly shocked when I saw that, because sort of the first lesson of strategic communications, and as a recovering speechwriter, you don't mention the thing that you're most worried about. So, you know, it's like Nixon saying, "I'm not a crook," and then
immediately declare that it reminds you of the worst case scenario that could be happening
exactly.
to you.
And it's like, if I saw on Twitter people making comparisons to 1917, I think initially I would have been like, wow, that's a little overwrought. But then here is Putin highlighting 1917, and of course that is when there was mutiny on the Russian front lines. You know, the year of revolution, which topples the Tsar, and then, you know, eventually leads to a communist revolution. But the Tsar being toppled is what you think of in a mutiny on the front lines when you invoke 1917. Do you think that, you know, part of what we're seeing here is caused by the situation on the front, where there's growing concern amongst the either average Russian soldier, but obviously amongst Wagner, who is playing a lead role in the fighting of Bakhmut? Is this just a Prigozhin power play, or is there something deeper here that suggests kind of a 1917 style potential collapse?
I think part of it is definitely that Prigozhin and Wagner broadly has wanted to get off the front lines. They initially went in, and in the early months of their involvement in Ukraine, it was actually very positive for Prigozhin. He was able to get a boost in his reputation, his political power, his relationship with Putin improved, and all of that was because he was able to sort of come in and take the place of some of the confidants in the MOD that had been blamed for those early military failures. He could come in and say, oh, we'll come in and assist, and they had some early successes on the front lines, and Prigozhin really viewed it as a way to boost his own reputation and boost the reputation of Wagner. However, as they've gotten more and more bogged down in places like Bakhmut, and as he's continued to struggle against the Ministry of Defense, it's quickly grown to a point where this is no longer advantageous to Prigozhin, and if anything, it's distracting from the actual gains that he can make in his broader empire of mercenaries and shell companies, which are outside of the European continent. And so he's been looking for a way to step back already. This was an opportunity for that, but that's certainly not how to do it.
No, I think, well, I mean, it's bureaucratic infighting sort of being made public to the nth degree.
Exactly. But, well, and I think that's actually part of what led him to take such extreme measures, thinking that, you know, I don't think that Prigozhin thought Putin was going to respond in such strong terms. He didn't think he was going to view it as an attempt on him. He really viewed it as an attempt on the Ministry of Defense. Mm-hmm. And he thought, I would assume, I can't really tell you what the man is thinking. I don't know that anyone can at this point. But I believe that he thought this was still certainly beyond the criticisms he had done before. He had an army going forward. But he thought it was still in the same ballpark of what Putin had been allowing and perhaps even encouraging in recent months, which is this escalating tension between Prigozhin and the Ministry of Defense, the criticisms that Prigozhin was able to bring forward of the way that the military was running operations in Ukraine, things that Putin himself couldn't say, especially when he's still trying to manage the narrative that the situation in Ukraine is actually going well, that it's actually strong. And this was just a bigger version of rebelling against the Ministry of Defense, but he massively miscalculated in terms of how that would be taken.
So, Jeff, just over to you. I mean, is this a case where Putin just kind of thought he was doing this, what he normally does, just playing elites off each other, and one decided to do something rather rash, and that the system will sort of trundle on? Or, I think to Maria's point earlier, is this something where you start to see elites, maybe those that thought the war was kind of ill-advised to begin with, that have seen a lot of their money and finances sort of strangled a bit by economic sanctions and the decline in the Russian economy, start to think that, you know what, maybe Putin's hold on power is not as strong as we thought, and if a guy like Prigozhin could, if he just kept going and actually came and took over power, I'd be screwed, and ergo I need to start to think about a post-Putin plan. Do you think we're going to start seeing a lot of scheming happening, or is this now, are people? What do you think will happen now with within the Russian elite?
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned before, I think other people are going to get ideas from this, even if it doesn't come from the military side the way that Prigozhin's challenge came. I think you actually put your finger on it pretty well. There are a lot of people in the Russian elite who are unhappy. Some of them are on the Prigozhin side who are unhappy because they think the war is being fought incompetently and they want to fight it better. There are others who think that the war was a mistake from the beginning, and for the last year and change, they've been forced to kind of keep their head down because of the climate of repression and fear that's resulted. But I think if they perceive that the regime is less secure, less stable than it was last week, then they may seek to challenge it in other ways as well. So I don't think that we're at February 1917 yet, but there's certainly, there's not only the military mutiny aspect of it, but there's also what's happening on the home front. And that was a key element of what happened in February 1917. There were bread strikes in St. Petersburg or Petrograd that the families of the people at the front were involved in, and eventually the people at the front decided, why are we fighting for this when our families are at home and can't feed themselves? So I don't think you've seen a breakdown on the home front to that degree yet. The Russian economy is not doing well. Standards of living, especially outside of places like Moscow, are not good. But it hasn't reached crisis proportions yet. But I do think that what we're seeing from Prigozhin's mutiny is that there is dissatisfaction. That dissatisfaction comes from different places on the political spectrum. And because this whole series of events over the last couple of days has shown that maybe the regime doesn't have the same degree of manual control over the power vertical as perhaps we thought it did, that it's going to be easier for people to take the initiative and to try and do things, whether that is to try and topple Putin, which is a big ask, or to at least try and change the dynamics of power within his inner circle in a way that might lead to the war being fought in a different way, or to seek some kind of exit from the war.
If I could actually add on to that as well, I completely agree. And I think that, as you're looking at these different political factions within Russia, these different strands of public opinion, including those who were skeptical or critical of the war from the beginning, or those who might be growing to doubt it, they not only now are looking broadly at what they are able to see of what's going on in Ukraine for the war, but in Prigozhin's message on Saturday, he very clearly, sort of point by point, went through and countered Putin's justification for the war in Ukraine, which is a huge blow to Putin, because it's not just an anti-war advocate coming out and saying this. It's not just his usual political rivals saying this. This is someone who, up until now, has been a close confidant of Putin's, someone who has been helping to execute the war, who has secured some of the, I'd say, high-profile or even only big successes of the war in Wagner's operations. And he's coming out and saying, okay, I lived it. I was on the inside, and none of this was real. All of this was made up to manipulate you. And that is a huge blow to Putin's narrative.
To that, I will add that, first of all, Prigozhin is quite well known in Russia. There's not a great many polls, as you can imagine, but Open Minds Institute, a Ukrainian think tank that runs polls in Russia, they're internet-based, so they might be a little bit overinflated, shows that 70 to 80% of Russians have heard of Prigozhin, at least somewhat.
That was before this.
It was before this, and just one day before Prigozhin's mutiny, 21% of Russians believe that he is capable or somewhat capable of governing Russia, according to the poll, which is still below 73% that Putin is enjoying. But then again, it was one day before the mutiny. Maybe the numbers have changed. That I wanted to flag probably is overinflated, but it's just to make this point that he is noticeable already at the national scale, which means a lot in Russia's environment. We, again, highly controlled media environment where actually little outside information penetrates. Second of all, on who might be the people considering these opportunities that are now opening up in Russia, I wanted to flag these so-called Z patriots, Strelkov Girkin among them, right? He's very active on Telegram, highly popular, represents the beliefs of these hardcore people with true beliefs, unlike most of the Russian society that remains highly neutral or indifferent. This is the group of patriots who feel, first of all, highly unhappy about what's going on the front lines, and at the same time also somewhat humiliated, I'd say, by what we've seen this weekend. And Strelkov Girkin, among others, he openly called for essentially self-organization after this whole situation with Prigozhin happened. He was like, we can no longer accept the situation, we need to do something, let's organize and consider something going forward. A lot of people are also pointing out the fact that next year is when we have Putin's elections coming, re-elections, shall we say?
Elections.
Yes, quote unquote. And this is, again, something that does not bode well for the stability of the regime.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so a couple of points on this. You know, first of all, I'm glad you brought up Strelkov or Girkin, because I think he's probably, apart from Prigozhin, the most visible face of the kind of pro-war opposition. And in a lot of ways, he's kind of stayed on the sidelines of some of these things, but he also has this reputation as somebody who's competent, who's loyal, who's patriotic, and I think has a significant following. And this gets to another issue here that I think is important, because, you know, you rightly mentioned the monopoly on communication that the Kremlin enjoys, but it's not primarily through the state-controlled media that people like Prigozhin or Strelkov have come to the attention of the Russian public. They have their own ability to reach out and pass messages, and they do this on Telegram, they do this by posting videos online.
Ways to outreach.
Yeah, and I think that the Kremlin, because it's a little bit living in the past perhaps, I think has been caught a little bit unaware by the extent to which people like Girkin and Prigozhin have been able to kind of construct this narrative outside of the formal channels that exist. And I think that's a danger too, because I don't think they understand how this independent kind of social media ecosystem works.
And Prigozhin's escapade shows that it actually matters a lot, right? Because Prigozhin was all about social media, these videos that he put out, and they would, again, gather a lot of followers. Last but not least, I wanted to point out, we've been waiting for elite split to happen for a year and a half, and I think finally it happened. Because Prigozhin, for all his shortcomings, probably is elite, right? We cannot say he's not an elite member. So here it comes, finally.
But keep in mind where it's coming from, right? It's not the
Certainly
liberal
not
urban
the
elite.
system liberals.
It's not Alexei Navalny that we're talking
So
about.
the beautiful Russia of the future, not as beautiful as we hoped.
So maybe Prigozhin was just online a little too much and in his own sort of ecosystem. But it also speaks to something that Russian hardliners were sort of given space, political space. And while, you know, I think you're on something there, Jeff, with the Kremlin sort of not really understanding the potential implications of that. They were cracking down. They're cracking. If you were the other way and advocating against the war from more of a pacifist direction, you would find yourself with a knock on your door. Do we think now that the space that Russian hardliners have basically been given, I would say, to let off steam, to critique how the war was run, but from kind of a more aggressive perspective, that we could see a real crackdown from Putin, that Putin now needs to reestablish himself as in charge of this power vertical, and so that political space for the right is now going to be limited? Jeff, do you think we're going to see a real crackdown in the days, weeks, months ahead?
Yeah, I would imagine that that's the case. I mean, I think probably this recognition about the ability of the far right to organize outside of official channels is coming in reaction to the events that we've seen over the last couple of days. Let me just add one other thing, though. I think part of the reason that they've allowed the far right to act in this way for the last year plus is because they're actually concerned about the political ambitions of the military. And this is a long-running concern in Russia. When the military gets too powerful, as it tends to do during wartime, it becomes a danger to political stability. And there's always been this kind of mistrust of strong military leaders. I mean, if you think about people like Zhukov during World War II, who kind of need to be cut down a peg when their ambitions get a little bit too large. And so in some ways, I think the toleration of people like Prigozhin was precisely because there were concerns in the leadership about the military getting too big for its britches if it didn't have this kind of rival power to contain it and keep it in check. And now, if they're going to crack down on the far right this way, then they have to do something else in order to make sure that the military doesn't start growing out of hand.
I think that's maybe a good segue to talk about what this will mean for the Russian military and what this will mean for maybe the war in Ukraine. Katrina, how do you see this playing out? I mean, I think if I were Ukrainian, I would probably not want to see a change in Gerasimov and the leadership of the Russian General Staff, or Shoigu. Do you anticipate a change and Putin making a change there, or what do you think the impacts will be on Russia's ability to wage this war going forward?
Yeah, I think that at least immediately we're unlikely to see a personnel change there, just because that would look like yet another level of weakness. You had Prigozhin just really targeting the two of them this whole time, calling for them to step down. And so then if right after accepting the terms of what, at least based on what is made public, is an extremely gentle agreement to stop that march toward Moscow, if then Putin is seen as capitulating to Prigozhin's demands immediately afterward, I think that's a step too far. I could see kind of in the longer term, particularly as we see the Ukrainian counteroffensive continue, as we see what happens, especially if Wagner troops are either leaving the front or falling under new command, I could see Putin using failures there or setbacks as an excuse to then change out leadership and likely go through the song and dance of, thank you for your great service during the operation and bring someone else in. But I don't think he can possibly do it when it looks like it was based on Prigozhin's demands.
And I'm, part of me now thinks that the potential for, if Ukraine can make actual, real territorial gains, at which point, thus far in the counteroffensive, they haven't made the kind of gains that I think many of us wish they had been making. But if they're able to make sizable territorial gains, it seems to raise the stakes even higher for Putin and the Kremlin, that it's another point of weakness. And Putin gave another national address where he sort of described the war as existential. Jeff, do you see this now as sort of an existential war for Putin? And that if the counteroffensive goes really badly for Russia, that he would be in real trouble and put even more sort of gasoline on the current fire?
Well, yes and no. I think from the beginning this war has been existential for Putin, which is different from it being existential for Russia. I think Russia can decide to pull its troops out of Ukraine and live within its internationally recognized borders and be perfectly fine. The problem, I think, is that Putin has staked so much of his own reputation, his own legacy on this war, and has described the war in such apocalyptic terms that politically I don't see how he can back down from it. So I do think that if the Ukrainian counteroffensive, either this one or if the war continues going on, if ultimately it looks like the war is beginning to tilt pretty substantially in the Ukrainian direction, that does pose a significant threat to Putin. As far as pouring further gasoline on the fire, I'm a little bit agnostic about that, because I think that we've seen already things like the destruction of the Novokakhovka Dam, targeting of civilians, mass murder in occupied cities. I mean, in a lot of ways, the Russians have already poured a lot of gasoline on the fire. And short of, conducting strikes on NATO territory, which I think is extremely unlikely, or escalation to use of tactical nuclear weapons, which I think is also extremely unlikely, there's not a whole lot more they can do. I mean, I think we can see more of these attacks on civilian infrastructure, more attempts to, impose suffering on innocent civilians, but we've already seen that to a pretty substantial degree. So I do think it's likely that we would see more of that this is going to continue to be an ugly, dirty war with a lot of collateral damage. But in terms of the kind of really apocalyptic scenarios that I think you're sort of implied in your question, I think those are less likely.
Yeah, it's sort of Prigozhin, despite all the complaints and wanting more ammunition for Wagner forces, it wasn't really outlining, at least as far as I could tell, sort of a new policy agenda for fighting the war. It seems like Putin is pretty much engaging in the hardline approach to the conflict.
Yeah, I think what Prigozhin wanted was that the war would be fought more effectively with less corruption, with more sort of organization of society, and with just better organization and discipline within the military, more like what he had in Wagner.
Seems like a typical think tank report. Just do this better.
Well, I think Prigozhin might be in search of a job.
Yeah,
so.
well, I don't think he's not going to be a non-resident here anytime soon. But Maria, maybe to talk about the impact on Russian public opinion, because the Russian forces on the front lines would be seeing the kind of chaos and mayhem that's happening behind them, and how do you think the Russian public is going to react to what they've just witnessed?
So, as I said, most of what the Russian public opinion reflects is where they sense the status quo is at. So in a lot of ways, usually, and that's a very legitimate complaint, when we run polls, what we measure, as a matter of fact, is TV propaganda. And the way Putin and the Kremlin propaganda are now trying to present it, now that they got the signals, which they did not have during the weekend, so they were really either silent or really lost, visibly lost. Now they're presenting it as a wise, strong action by Kremlin and Putin in particular, who's been able unilaterally to stop this insurgency from destroying the homeland and whatnot. So it will be really interesting to see the polls, how they respond. But I would not be surprised not to see a major difference because of that. Does it see there is no reputational damage? No, because the true dynamic unravels underneath these polls. Something interesting, though, based again on the data provided by the Open Minds Institute, who are doing a very good and timely job, they actually show that Wagner supporters in their polls tend to be less supportive of the war continuation than those people in their sample who support the Ministry of Defense in this artificial contestation between Wagner and Russian MOD, which is interesting, right? It seems like Wagner and Prigozhin's figure at this point accumulates everything that's wrong about this war in the mind of different people, which again may or may not be exploited further depending on what happens next. So once again, I think though the fundamental damage to the Kremlin is really, really, really big, and that's because the status quo has shattered. Whether the polls are going to be reflecting that or not, we'll see.
Yeah. What strikes me is that, if you think about the decision that could come to the Kremlin that has the most kind of political difficulties would be additional mobilization, and that has direct impact on the war, and it looks like there's a need for Russia to probably mobilize in order to really sustain this fight. I mean, do you think they're going to be able to, Putin may be able to mobilize
at least before the war or before the election? This has been something that Putin was trying to avoid, the way it seems, because it's been highly unpopular. And in general, the interesting part that we see here, I mean, and also historically, since the start of this war, is that most of the things that are most damaging to Putin are his own doing. Right, that the mobilization was the first thing, which really, as a result of which the drops the polls dropped, and then of course Wagner and unleashed Prigozhin, who definitely is this sort of in the Frankenstein sort of replay, really Putin's own doing as well. Also one other thing that we see, right, the patterns in which the way in which Putin responds to this crisis, which is unprecedented, they are very recognizable from the past. He is slow. He takes time, right? He does not act fast. He is a little bit behind it, right? It's the famous Marcus's novel, The Autumn of the Patriarch, right? It seems that the regime is a little bit behind the sequence of the event that he started. For example, the Security Council meeting, which just happened today, in response to all these developments, was actually supposed to be happening as these developments were unraveling, etc., etc. He probably will be slow to respond to the military demands on the ground and maybe making some much-needed personnel changes as well. So this all does not really look good for Putin at all going forward.
What does this mean for Wagner, Katrina, going forward? Will Wagner exist? It seems like it won't, based off of Putin's recent speech and basically giving a few alternatives for those in Wagner to either go to Belarus, sign with the Russian military, or just go home. What do you think happens to it?
So there are a lot of questions up in the air, obviously. I think one of the big ones is when Putin says all of that, when he talks about this ultimatum between joining the military or going to Belarus, is he talking about the wider Wagner network, or is he talking about the Wagner troops who are in Ukraine and Russia? Because there is a substantial amount of Wagner presence throughout other parts of the world. They're in the Middle East, they're in Latin America, and most significantly, they're in Africa.
They're basically like an autocratic support service, right? That you call and say, help me, and then they can, do you need security?
Exactly. The most ominous Ghostbusters, yes. Who are you going to call? But they're deeply entrenched in a lot of these countries, particularly places like the Central African Republic, where they are more or less running much of the government, running security and military operations, but also everything from bureaucratic offices to emergency response services. They've developed these close relationships in countries that they're operating in. They're embedded with the military in places like Mali. And more importantly, it's not just the mercenary paramilitary troops that we think of when we hear Wagner. There are also a wide variety of other companies, shell companies, financial intermediaries, all linked back to Prigozhin. Notably, Prigozhin is that central node in the network that everyone's connected to. They're not all linked back to Wagner as the center. It's Prigozhin. And these are the companies that are getting mining concessions to exploit natural resources, to smuggle gold and diamonds out of Sudan and the Central African Republic. They're the ones who have purchased rights to control local radio stations, that have established French language media outlets to spread Russian propaganda and disinformation. In the legacy of Prigozhin's, again, Internet Research Agency, there is a huge network across the African continent that is fulfilling Russia's geopolitical goals, that has really reinvigorated Moscow's footprint on the continent. And if you just dissolve Wagner, that disappears. If you deeply break it up and cut off a lot of those communication nodes, you cut out some of those financial intermediaries, it falls apart. If you take over the paramilitary side, but not all of the companies, you're doing the work without the gain. In many cases, they've gone in for these underpriced contracts, often getting the job to work for a state because they're able to underbid all of the competitors who have things like experience, regional knowledge, all of those silly things. And so really, I think what we're going to see is Prigozhin trying to shore up control of this big shadowy network that he has. Control, yes, of our traditional Wagner mercenaries, but also these shell companies, the resource exploitation operations, the disinformation and propaganda services. And at the same time, we'll have Moscow jockeying to do the same. That could go in a number of different directions. I expect that we're likely to see some splintering of the network. Some of it Prigozhin will likely try to keep close to him, especially in areas where he has close personal relationships, either with his own men or with local partners. We'll see some of it taken over by the state, some of it likely the more paramilitary operations pulled into the military, or otherwise put under the control of new leadership that are just much more reined in under the Ministry of Defense's control. It's important to note here that Wagner is neither the first nor the last private military company that Russia has used for this purpose, despite, of course, the fact that private military companies are illegal in Russia this whole time, which is actually what gives Putin such leverage over Prigozhin, even if he hadn't staged the march to Moscow. But for those broader companies, and really kind of the most, at least financially lucrative parts of that Wagner network, things like Lobai Invest, Mero Gold, which is a subsidiary of M Invest. These are shell companies operating in the Central African Republic and in Sudan, respectively. They're likely to be just put under new leadership, someone who's seen as a loyalist to Putin, someone who has experience in the region, perhaps even someone who is a former colleague in the Wagner network. We've seen some competing private military companies formed recently, including one, Convoy, which is led by both the head of Crimea and the man who was formerly Prigozhin's sort of right-hand man running operations in Africa. People like that, if Putin feels that they're loyal enough to him or someone like them, could be put in charge of these commercial enterprises that really give a benefit by being ostensibly, private companies, but can still continue to benefit Moscow.
But this will be difficult, right?
Yeah.
And in some ways,
none of this will be easy, and none of it will be fast.
In some ways, that sort of points to Prigozhin's leverage, perhaps, that perhaps could be possible for Prigozhin to maintain some of what he's doing on behalf of the Kremlin, but lose the Russia part. Or maybe not, just given the circumstances. I mean, I think that this is where probably the reticence to go after Prigozhin was pointing to the complexity here. And also, this is a critical tool of Russian foreign policy. So this has real implications, not just inside of Russia, but outside. So we're approaching the kind of final 5 minutes, and so maybe we'll do a quick lightning round. But maybe to kick off kind of one thought, maybe for you all to react to, is that there's sort of been this presumption that Russia could really just indefinitely sustain a long war. And it strikes me that one of the things that this sort of highlights is that a long war for Russia has costs. I mean, we've experienced this here in the United States, where we can indefinitely sustain long wars in Afghanistan, nearly 20 years, in Iraq, in Vietnam. But over time, that sustaining the long war has real implications on our society and our willingness to keep going. And it's so, here we're starting to see internal cracks. Do you think this impacts Russia's ability in its calculus on whether it can sustain a long war? If you want to react to that or anything else to sort of close it out, maybe we'll go around. Maria.
The big question is essentially if Prigozhin is the black swan for Putin regime. I guess we will see. This is something in the making going forward. This is by far, I'd say, the most interesting development we've seen since the start of this horrible war. One big question to me, if the regime will decide to keep Prigozhin alive. Because honestly, you have the power center, quite influential, probably the second most influential at this point in Russia, emerging, and Putin is not exactly known for leaving those who betrayed him alive. So to me, if the regime is still sort of making certain sense, right, and is willing to at least preserve this appearance of strength, we should see Prigozhin gone sometime soon. If that does not happen, though, this will create a very interesting dynamic with essentially Leo Trotsky outside of the country trying maybe to build some certain insurgencies, and knowing Prigozhin's psychology and personality, we can be assured, right, that he will not leave this hanging if given the opportunity. So I think this is a very interesting development. We'll keep watching. I'm just happy to see finally certain cracks emerging in the system. And I think one thing I'll say, this is a great opportunity for Ukrainians. They should use it. They certainly should not let it slide, but pursue this opportunity. As Russia starts cracking internally, they should certainly be pushing extra externally to deepen these cracks.
Jeff.
Yeah, so Prigozhin should watch out for people with ice picks.
And Windows.
Yeah, well,
And Novichoks.
So there is a long history of this sort of thing. I think that's what we're highlighting here. Max, to your question about the long war, I've been pushing back since this war started against the idea that a long war favors Russia, because I think that Russia's ability to mobilize resources of all kinds, financial, human, technical, and others, is relatively limited. And the sanctions, which we haven't talked about in here, but the sanctions that have been imposed by the United States and Europe since the start of this war make all of that mobilization much, much more difficult. And we're seeing it now with the impact on the Russian economy. Figures for industrial production are down. Figures for inflation are up, currency depreciation. There's a lot of lingering problems with the economy that are going to become more and more problematic as the war goes on. That's leaving aside the consequences of the very high numbers of casualties that Russia is suffering in Ukraine, which is especially problematic because a lot of the people who are being sent into the conflict are conscripts, and this gets to the point made earlier about a second wave of conscription and what that could mean for political stability. So I think that Putin gambled initially on a short war, and having failed to triumph in a short war, has been pushing the narrative in Russian state media and in public statements that Russia can win a long war because the West is distracted, the West is fickle, the West is decadent, and that all Russia has to do is hold out. And I think what we're seeing now with the economic consequences of the sanctions and Prigozhin's mutiny, or whatever we want to call it, is that there are real stresses that Russia is facing, and that its ability to fight a war of this intensity over the longer term is really, really problematic. There is one big wild card in all of this, which is what happens in the domestic political context in Western countries, above all the United States. Of course, we have an election coming up in 2024 as well. How the war in Ukraine plays in that election is going to be very important. And I think there's a hope in Moscow that there will be a pro-peace candidate who comes out of that election and comes to power in January 2025. And that really seems to be the hope that Russia is hanging its hat on right now, because I think, as we've seen, the longer this war goes on, everything else being equal, the more problematic it's going to be for not only Russia's prospects of victory, but for Russia's prospects of political stability.
Okay.
I absolutely agree that Russia's unlikely to be successful with the long war for all of the reasons that our colleagues have just said. I mean, my colleagues in the Transnational Threats Project here at CSIS have done analysis showing that in Russia's war in Ukraine, they've suffered more casualties than all of Russia's other military engagements since World War II combined. That, plus the resources, plus the domestic challenges, plus the cracks within the system, I don't see how they can sustain this long term. The other piece that I would then throw in, and this is sort of looking forward more to the future, speculating a bit more, can they sustain those troops coming home? Can they sustain taking on a large number of Wagner troops if they choose to do so? Those troops are going to come back to Russia with stories of what was really happening on the front. Stories of fighting against Ukrainians, fighting against people who are just like them. The stories of seeing the effects of that number of casualties more than all of those other wars combined. The trauma of being there on the front lines, of being poorly resourced, poorly treated, used as cannon fodder. Then you also, if you have a large number of Wagner troops joining the official Russian military, these are individuals who, like some of the newer recruits in the military, have very little training, many of them pulled out of prisons, dealing with their either criminal histories or even just the societal stigma that comes with that. But of those who willingly joined Wagner, who signed on with past experience in the Russian military or in intelligence services in Russia, they, for the most part, chose Wagner because it pays better, it gives better benefits, and they were treated better in it. How are they going to react now when they're pulled into the Russian military once again, They're paid less, they're treated poorly, and they're also dealing with all of this trauma. They're stigmatized potentially, depending on what kind of crackdown we ultimately see against Prigozhin and those that have backed him. All of this feeds into an already unstable domestic environment where there are already cracks in the system. People are already doubting the narratives that they're being sold. And so, to some extent, I don't think that Russia can afford a long war, but I'm also not sure it can afford to bring everyone home.